Section 16 of The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Andy Minter. The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories by Arnold, Bennett. Section 16. The Tight Hand. 1. The tight hand was Mrs. Garlick's. A miser, she was not the ordinary miser, being exceptional in the fact that her temperament was joyous. She had reached the 30th year of her widowhood and the 60th of her age, with cheerfulness unimpaired. The people of Bursley, when they met her sometimes of a morning, coming down into the town from her singular house up at Toft End, would be conscious of pleasure in her brisk gait, her slightly malicious but broad-minded smile, and her cheerful greeting. She was always in black. She always wore one of those nodding black bonnets, which possess neither back nor front, nor any clue of any kind to their ancient mystery. She always wore a mantle which hid her waist and spread forth in curves over her hips, and as her skirts stuck stiffly out, she thus had the appearance of one who had been to sleep since 1870, and who had got up, thoroughly refreshed and bright, into the costume of her original period. She always carried a reticule. It was known that she suffered from dyspepsia, and this gave real value to her reputation for cheerfulness. Her nearness, closeness, stinginess, close-fistedness, as the quality was variously called, was excused to her, partly because it had been at first caused by a genuine need of severe economy, she having been left poorly off by a husband who had lived in a large way, partly because it inconvenienced nobody, save perhaps her servant Maria, and partly because it was so picturesque and afforded much excellent material for gossip. Mrs. Garlick's latest feat of stinginess was invariably a safe card to play in the conversational game. Each successive feat was regarded as funnier than the one before it. Maria, who had a terrific respect for appearances, never disclosed her mistress's peculiarities. It was Mrs. Garlick herself who humorously ventilated and discussed them. Mrs. Garlick, being a philosopher, got quite as much amusement as anyone out of her most striking quality. "Is there anything interesting in the Signal to-night?" she had innocently asked one of her sons. "No," said Sam Garlick unthinkingly. "Well, then," said she, "suppose I turn out the gas and we talk in the dark." Soon afterwards Sam Garlick married. His mother remarked dryly that she was not surprised. It was supposed that this feat of turning out the gas when the Signal happened to fail in interest would remain unparalleled in the annals of Five Towns skinflintery. But in the summer after her son's marriage, Mrs. Garlick was discovered in the evening habit of pacing slowly up and down Toft Lane. She said that she hated sitting in the dark alone, that Maria would not have her in the kitchen, and that she saw no objection to making harmless use of the Corporation gas by strolling to and fro under the Corporation gas lamps on fine nights. Compared to this feat, the previous feat was as naught. It made Mrs. Garlick celebrated even as far as Longshaw. It made the entire community proud of such an inventive miser. Once Mrs. Garlick, before what she called her dinner, asked Maria, "Will there be enough mutton for to-morrow?" And Maria had gloomily and firmly said, "No." "Will there be enough if I don't have any to-day?" pursued Mrs. Garlick. And Maria had said, "Yes." "I won't have any, then," said Mrs. Garlick. Maria was offended. There are some things that a servant will not stand. She informed Mrs. Garlick that if Mrs. Garlick meant to go on going on like that, she should leave. She wouldn't stay in such a house. In vain Mrs. Garlick protested that the less she ate the better she felt. In vain she referred to her notorious indigestion. "Either you eats your dinner, mum, or out I clears." Mrs. Garlick offered her a rise of £1 a year to stay. She was already, because she would stop, and most servants wouldn't, receiving £18, a high wage. She refused the increment. Pushed by her passion for economy in mutton, Mrs. Garlick then offered her a rise of £2 a year. Maria accepted, and Mrs. Garlick went without mutton. Persons unacquainted with the psychology of parsimoniousness may hesitate to credit this incident, but more advanced students of humanity will believe it without difficulty. In the Five Towns it is known to be true. 2. The supreme crisis, to which the foregoing is a mere prelude, in the affairs of Mrs Garlick and Maria, was occasioned by the extraordinary performances of the Mayor of Bursley. This particular mayor was invested with the chain almost immediately upon the conclusion of a great series of revival services, in which he had conspicuously figured. He had an earthenware manufactory halfway up the hill between Bursley and its loftiest suburb, Toft End, and the smoke of his chimneys and kilns was generally blown by a favourable wind against the windows of Mrs Garlick's house, which stood by itself. Mrs Garlick made nothing of this. In the Five Towns they think no more of smoke than the world at large used to think of smallpox. The smoke plague is exactly as curable as the smallpox plague. It continues to flourish, not because smokiness is cheaper than cleanliness, it is dearer, but because a greater nuisance than smoke is the nuisance of a change, and because human nature in general is rather like Mrs Garlick. Its notion of economy is to pay heavily for the privilege of depriving itself of something, mutton or cleanliness. However, this mayor was different. He had emerged from the revival services with a very tender conscience, and in assuming the chain of office he assumed the duty of setting an example. It was to be no excuse to him that, in spite of bye-laws, 10,000 other chimneys and kilns were breathing out black filth all over the Five Towns. So far as he could cure it, the smoke nuisance had to be cured, or his conscience would know the reason why. So he sat on the borough bench and fined himself for his own smoke, and then he installed gas ovens. The town laughed, of course, and spoke of him alternately as a rash fool, a hypocrite, and a mere pompous ass. In a few months smoke had practically ceased to ascend from the mayoral manufactory. The financial result to the mayor was such as to encourage the tenderness of consciences. But that is not the point. The point is that Mrs Garlick, re-entering her house one autumn morning after a visit to the market, paused to look at the windows, and then said to Maria, "Maria, what have you to do this afternoon?" Now Mrs Garlick well knew what Maria had to do. "I'm going to change the curtains, mum." "Well, you needn't," said Mrs Garlick. "It's made such a difference up here, there being so much less smoke, that upon my word the curtains will do another 3 months quite well." "Oh, well, mum, I never did," observed Maria, meaning that so shocking a proposal was unprecedented in her experience. Yet she was 35. "Quite well," said Mrs Garlick gaily. Maria said no more. But in the afternoon Mrs Garlick, hearing sounds in the drawing-room, went into the drawing-room and discovered Maria balanced on a pair of steps and unhooking lace curtains. "Maria," said she, "what are you doing?" Maria answered, as busy workers usually do answer unnecessary questions from idlers. "I should have thought you could see, mum," she said, tartly, insolently, inexcusably. One curtain was already down. "Put that curtain back," Mrs Garlick commanded. "I shall put no curtain back," said Maria grimly. Her excited respiration shook the steps. "All to save the washing of 4 pairs of curtains. And you know you beat the washerwoman down to 10d. a pair last March. 3 and 4d, that is. For the sake of 3 and 4d you're willing for all Toft End to point their fingers at these here windows." "Put that curtain back," Mrs Garlick repeated haughtily. She saw that she had touched Maria in a delicate spot, her worship of appearances. The mutton was simply nothing to these curtains. Nevertheless, as there seemed to be some uncertainty in Maria's mind as to who was the mistress of the house, Mrs Garlick's business was to dispel that uncertainty. It may be said without exaggeration that she succeeded in dispelling it. But she did not succeed in compelling Maria to rehang the curtain. Maria had as much force of character as Mrs Garlick herself. The end of the scene, whose details are not sufficiently edifying to be recounted, was that Maria went upstairs to pack her box, and Mrs Garlick personally rehung the curtain. One's dignity is commonly an expensive trifle, and Mrs Garlick's dignity was expensive. To avoid prolonging the scene, she paid Maria a month's wages in lieu of notice, £1 13 and 4d. Then she showed her the door. Doubtless, Mrs Garlick meditated, the girl thought she would get another rise of wages. If so, she was finely mistaken. A nice thing if the servant is to decide when curtains are to go to wash. She would soon learn, when she went into another situation, what an easy, luxurious place she had lost by her own stupid folly. 3 and 4pences might be picked up on the street, eh? And so on. After Maria's stormy departure, Mrs Garlick regained her sense of humour and her cheerfulness, but the inconveniences of being without Maria were important. 3. On the second day following, Mrs Garlick received a letter from young Lawton, the solicitor. Young Lawton, aged over 40, was not so called because in the Five Towns youthfulness is supposed to extend to the confines of 45, but because he had succeeded his father, known as Old Lawton. It is true that the latter had been dead many years. The Five Towns, however, is not a country of change. This letter pointed out that Maria's wages were not £1.13 a month, but £1.13 a month plus her board and lodging, and that consequently, in lieu of a month's notice, Maria demanded £1.13 plus the value of a month's keep. There was more in this letter than met the eye of Mrs Garlick. Young Lawton's offices were cleaned by a certain old woman. This old woman had a nephew. This nephew was a warehouseman at the Mayor's Works and lived up at Toft End, and at least twice every day he passed by Mrs Garlick's house. He was a respectful worshipper of Maria's, and it had been exclusively on his account that Maria had insisted on changing the historic curtains. Nobody else of the slightest importance ever passed in front of the house, for important people have long since ceased to live at Toft End. The subtle flattering of an unspoken love had impelled Maria to leave her situation rather than countenance soiled curtains. She could not bear that the warehouseman should suspect her of tolerating even the semblance of dirt. She had permitted the warehouseman to hear the facts of her departure from Mrs Garlick's. The warehouseman was nobly indignant, advising an action for assault and battery. Through his aunt's legal relations, Maria had been brought into contact with the law, and while putting aside as inadvisable an action for assault and battery, the lawyer had counselled a just demand for more money. Hence the letter. Mrs Garlick called at Lawton's office, and Mr Lawton being out, she told an office boy to tell him, with her compliments, that she should not pay. Then the county court bailiff paid her a visit, and left her with a blue summons for £2 and 8s, being 4 weeks of 12s each. Many house mistresses in Bursley sympathized with Mrs Garlick when she fought this monstrous claim. She fought it gaily, with the aid of a solicitor. She might have won it, if the county court judge had not happened to be in one of his peculiar moods, one of those moods in which he felt himself bound to be original at all costs. He delivered a judgment sympathizing with domestic servants in general, and with Maria in particular. It was a lively trial. That night the Signal was very interesting. When Mrs Garlick had finished with the action, she had 2 and 3pence change out of a £5 note. Moreover, she was forced to employ a charwoman who had made a fine art of breaking china, of losing silver teaspoons down sinks, and of going home of a night with vast pockets full of things that belonged to her by only 9/10 of the law. The charwoman ended by tumbling through a window, smashing panes to the extent of 17 and 11pence, and irreparably ripping one of the historic curtains. Mrs Garlick then dismissed the charwoman, and sat down to count the cost of small economics. The privilege of half-dirty curtains had involved her in an expense of £9 19s, call it £10. It was in the afternoon. The figure of Maria crossed the recently repaired window. Without a second's thought, Mrs Garlick rushed out of the house. "Maria!" she cried abruptly, with grim humour. "Come here! Come right inside!" Maria stopped, and then obeyed. "Do you know how much you've let me in for with your wicked, disobedient temper?" "I'll have you know, mum," Maria retorted, putting her hands on the hips and forwarding her face. Their previous scene together was as nothing to this one in sound and fury, but the close was peace. The next day half Bursley knew that Maria had gone back to Mrs Garlick, and there was a facetious note about the episode in the Day by Day column of the Signal. The truth was that Maria and Mrs Garlick were made for each other. Maria would not look at the ordinary place. The curtains, as much as remained, were sent to the wash, but as 3 months had elapsed, the mistress reckoned that she had won. Still, the cleansing of the curtains had run up to appreciably more than £1 per curtain. The warehouseman did not ask for Maria's hand. The stridency of her behaviour in court had frightened him. Mrs Garlick's chief hobby continues to be the small economy. Happily, owing to the rise in the value of land and a fortunate investment, she is in fairly well-to-do circumstances. As she said one day to an acquaintance, "It's a good thing I can afford to keep a tight hand on things." End of Section 16. Section 17 of The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Andy Minter. The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories by Arnold, Bennett. Section 17. Why the Clock Stopped. 1. Mr Morfe and Mary Morfe, his sister, were sitting on either side of their drawing-room fire on a Friday evening in November, when they heard a ring of the front door. They both started and showed symptoms of nervous disturbance. They both said aloud that no doubt it was a parcel or something of that kind that had rung at the front door. And they both bent their eyes again on their respective books, which they were reading. Then they heard voices in the lobby, the servant's voice and another voice, and a movement of steps over the encaustic tiles towards the door of the drawing-room, and Miss Morfe ejaculated, "Really?" as though she was unwilling to believe that somebody on the other side of that drawing-room door contemplated committing a social outrage. She nevertheless began to fear the possibility. In the ordinary course it is not considered outrageous to enter a drawing-room, even at 9 o'clock at night, with the permission and encouragement of the servant in charge of portals. But the case of the Morfes was peculiar. Mr Morfe was a bachelor, aged 42, and looked older. Mary Morfe was a spinster, aged 38, and looked 37. Brother and sister had kept house together for 20 years. They were passionately and profoundly attached to each other, and did not know it. They grumbled at each other freely, and practised no more conversation when they were alone than the necessities of existence demanded. Even at meals they generally read. But still their mutual affection was tremendous. Moreover, they were very firmly fixed in their habits. Now, one of these habits was never to entertain company on Friday night. Friday night was their night of solemn privacy. The explanation of this habit offers a proof of the sentimental relations between them. Mr Morfe was an accountant. Indeed, he was the accountant in Bursley, and perhaps he knew more secrets of the ledgers of the principal earthenware manufacturers than some of the manufacturers did themselves. But he did not live for accountancy. At 5 o'clock every evening he was capable of absolutely forgetting it. He lived for music. He was the organist of St Luke's Church, with an industrious understudy, for he did not always rise for breakfast on Sundays. And more important, he was conductor of the Bursley Orpheus Glee and Madrigal Club, and herein lay the origin of those Friday nights. A Glee and Madrigal Club normally comprises women as well as men, and the women are apt to be youngish, prettyish, and somewhat fond of music. Further, the conductorship of a choir involves many and various social encounters. Now, Mary Morfe was jealous. Though Richard Morfe ruled his choir with whips, though his satiric tongue was a scorpion to the choir, though he never looked twice at any woman, though she was always saying that she wished he would marry, Mary Morfe was jealous. It was Mary Morfe who had created the institution of the Friday night, and she had created it in order to prove, symbolically and spectacularly, to herself, to him, and to the world, that he and she lived for each other alone. All their friends, Every member of the choir, in fact the whole of the respectable part of Bursley, knew quite well that in the Morfes' house Friday was most sacredly Friday. And yet a caller! "It's a woman!" murmured Mary. Until her ear had assured her of this fact, she had seemed to be more disturbed than startled by the stir in the lobby. And it was a woman. It was Miss Eva Harracles, one of the principal contraltos in the Glee and Madrigal Club. She entered richly blushing, and excusably a little nervous and awkward. She was a tall, agreeable creature of fewer than 30 years, dark, almost handsome, with fine lips and eyes, and an effective large hat and a good muff. In every physical way a marked contrast to the thin, prim, desiccated brother and sister. Richard Morfe flushed faintly. Mary Morfe grew more pallid. "I really must apologize for coming in like this," said Eva, as she shook hands cordially with Mary Morfe. She knew Mary very well indeed, for Mary was the librarian of the Glee and Madrigal Club. Mary never missed a rehearsal, though she cared no more for music than she cared for the national debt. She was a perfect librarian, and very good at unofficially prodding indolent members into a more regular attendance too. "Not at all," said Mary. "We were only reading. You aren't disturbing us in the least." Which, though polite, was a lie, and Eva Harracles sat down between them, and brother and sister abandoned their literature. "I can't stop," said she, glancing at the clock immediately in front of her eyes. "I must catch the last car for Silverhays." "You've got 20 minutes yet," said Mr. Morfe. "Because," said Eva, "I don't want that walk from Turnhill to Silverhays on a dark night like this." "No, I should think not indeed," said Mary Morfe. "You've got a full 20 minutes," Mr. Morfe repeated. The clock showed 3 minutes past 9. The electric cars to and from the town of Turnhill were rumbling past the very door of the Morfes every 5 minutes, and would continue to do so till midnight. But Silverhays is a mining village a couple of miles beyond Turnhill, and the service between Turnhill and Silverhays ceases before 10 o'clock. Eva's father was a colliery manager who lived on the outskirts of Silverhays. "I've got a piece of news," said Eva. "Yes?" said Mary Morfe. Mr. Morfe was taciturn. He stooped to nourish the fire. "About Mr. Loggerheads," said Eva, and stared straight at Mary Morfe. "About Mr. Loggerheads?" Mary Morfe echoed, and stared back at Eva, and the atmosphere seemed to have been thrown into a strange pulsation. Here, perhaps, I ought to explain that it was not the peculiarity of Mr. Loggerheads' name that produced the odd effect. Loggerheads is a local term for a harmless plant called the knapweed, Centaurea nigra, and it is also the appellation of a place, and of quite excellent people, and no one regards it as even the least bit odd. "I'm told," said Eva, "that he's going into the Hanbridge Choir." Mr. Loggerheads was the principal tenor of the Bursley Glee and Madrigal Club, and he was reckoned one of the finest after-dinner tenors in the Five Towns. The Hanbridge Choir was a rival organization, a vast and powerful affair that fascinated and swallowed promising singers from all the choirs of the vicinity. The Hanbridge Choir had sung at Windsor, and since that event there had been no holding it. All other choirs hated it with a homicidal hatred. "I'm told," Eva proceeded, "that the Birmingham and Sheffield Bank will promote him to the cashiership of the Hanbridge branch on the understanding that he joins the Hanbridge Choir. Shows what influence they have. And it shows how badly the Hanbridge Choir want him." Mr. Loggerheads was the cashier of the Bursley branch of the Birmingham and Sheffield Bank. "Who told you?" asked Mary Morfe curtly. Richard Morfe said nothing. The machinations of the manager of the Hanbridge Choir always depressed and disgusted him into silence. "Oh!" said Eva Harracles, "it's all about." By which she meant that it was in the air. "Everyone's talking of it." "And do they say Mr. Loggerheads has accepted?" Mary demanded. "Yes," said Eva. "Well," said Mary, "it's not true. A mistake," she added. "How do you know that it isn't true?" Mr. Morfe inquired doubtfully. "Since you're so curious," said Mary defiantly, "Mr. Loggerheads told me so himself." "When?" The other day." "You never said anything to me," protested Mr. Morfe. "It didn't occur to me," Mary replied. "Well, I'm very glad," remarked Eva Harracles, "but I thought I ought to let you know at once what was being said." Mary Morfe's expression conveyed the fact that, in her opinion, Eva Harracles' evening call was a vain thing, too lightly undertaken, and conceivably lacking in the nicest discretion. Whereupon Mr. Morfe was evidently struck by the advisability of completely changing the subject. And he did change it. He began to talk about certain difficulties in the choral parts of Havergal Brian's Vision of Cleopatra, a work which he meant the Bursley Glee and Madrigal Club to perform, though it should perish in the attempt. Growing excited in his dry way concerning the merits of this composition, he rose from his easy chair and went to search for it. Before doing so, he looked at the clock, which indicated 20 minutes past 9. "Am I all right for time?" asked Eva. "Yes, you're all right," said he. "If you go when that clock strikes 1/2 and take the next car down, you'll make the connection easily at Turnhill. I'll put you in the car." "Oh, thanks," said Eva. Mr. Morfe kept his modern choral music beneath a broad seat under the bow window. The music was concealed by a low curtain that ran on a rod, the ingenious device of Mary. He stooped down to find the Vision of Cleopatra, and at first he could not find it. Mary walked towards that end of the drawing room with a vague notion of helping him. And then Eva did the same, and then Mary walked back, and then Mr. Morfe happily put his hand on the Vision of Cleopatra. He opened the score for Eva's inspection, and began to hum passages and to point out others, and Eva also began to hum, and they hummed in concert, at intervals exclaiming against the wantonness with which Havergal Brian had invented difficulties. Eva glanced at the clock. "You're all right," Mr. Morfe assured her impatiently, and he too glanced at the clock. "You've still nearly 10 minutes," and proceeded with his critical and explanatory comments on the Vision of Cleopatra. He was capable of becoming almost delirious about music. Mary Morfe had seated herself in silence. At last Eva and Mr. Morfe approached the fire and the mantelpiece again. Mr. Morfe shut up the score, dismissed his delirium, and looked at the clock, quite prepared to see it pointing to 29½ minutes past 9. Instead, the clock pointed to only 22 minutes past 9. "By Jove!" he exclaimed. He went nearer. "By Jove!" he exclaimed again, rather more loudly. "I do believe that clock stopped." It had. The pendulum hung perpendicular, motionless, dead. He was astounded, for the clock had never been known to stop. It was a presentation clock of the highest guaranteed quality, offered to him as a small token of regard and esteem by the members of the Bursley Orpheus Glee and Madrigal Club, to celebrate the 12th anniversary of his felicitous connection with the said society. It had stood on his mantelpiece for 4 years, and had earned an absolutely first-class reputation for itself. He wound it up on the last day of each month, for it was a 30-odd day clock, specially made by a famous local expert, and he had not known it to vary by more than 10 minutes a month at the most. And lo! it had stopped in the very middle of the month. "Did you wind it up last time?" asked Mary. "Of course," he snapped. He had taken out his watch and was gazing at it. He turned to Eva. "It's 20 to 10," he said. "You've missed your connection at Turnhill, that's a certainty. I'm very sorry." Obviously there was only one course open to a gallant man whose clock was to blame, namely, to accompany Eva Harracles to Turnhill by car, to accompany her on foot to Silverhays, and then to walk back to Turnhill and come home again by car. A young woman could not be expected to perform that bleak and perhaps dangerous journey from Turnhill to Silverhays alone after 10 o'clock at night in November. Such was the clear course. But he dared scarcely suggest it. He dared scarcely suggest it because of his sister. He was afraid of Mary. The names of Richard Morfe and Eva Harracles had already been coupled in the mouth of gossip. And naturally Eva Harracles herself could not suggest that Richard should sally out and leave his sister alone on this night, specially devoted to sisterliness and brotherliness. And of course Eva thought Mary would never suggest it. But Eva was wrong there. To the amazement of both Richard and Eva, Mary calmly said, "Well, Dick, the least you can do now is to see Miss Harracles home. You'll easily be able to catch the last car back from Turnhill if you start at once. I dare say I shall go to bed." And in 3 minutes Richard Morfe and Eva Harracles had been sped into the night by Mary Morfe. The Morfes' house was at the corner of Trafalgar Road and Beech Street. The cars stopped at that corner in their wild course towards the town and towards Turnhill. A car was just coming. But instead of waiting for it, Richard Morfe and Eva Harracles deliberately turned their backs on Trafalgar Road and hurried side by side down Beech Street. Beech Street is a short street and ends in a nondescript, unlighted waste patch of ground. They arrived in the gloom of this patch, safe from all human inquisitiveness. And then Richard Morfe warmly kissed Eva Harracles in the mathematical centre of those lips of hers. And Eva Harracles showed no resentment of any kind, nor even shame. Yet she had been very carefully brought up. The sight would have interested Bursley immensely. It would have appealed strongly to Bursley's strong sense of the piquant. That dry old stick Dick Morfe kissing one of his contraltos in the dark at the bottom end of Beech Street. "Then you hadn't told her?" murmured Eva Harracles. No, said Richard, with a slight hesitation. "I was just going to begin to tell her when you called." Another woman might have pouted to learn that her lover had exhibited even a little cowardice in informing his family that he was engaged to be married. But Eva did not pout. She comprehended the situation and the psychology of the relations between brothers and sisters. She herself possessed both brothers and sisters. All the courting had been singularly secret and odd. "I shall tell her to morrow morning at breakfast," said Richard firmly. "Unless, after all, she isn't gone to bed when I get back." By a common impulse they now returned towards Trafalgar Road. "I say," said Richard, "what made you call?" "I was passing," said the beloved, "and somehow I couldn't help it. Of course I knew it wasn't true about Mr. Loggerheads, but I had to think of something." Richard was in ecstasy, had never been in such ecstasy. "I say," he said again, "I suppose you didn't put your finger against the pendulum of that clock?" "Oh, no!" she replied with emphasis. "Well, I'm jolly glad it did stop, anyway," said Richard. "What a lark, eh?" She agreed that the lark was ideal. They walked down the road till a car should overtake them. "Do you think she suspects anything?" Eva asked. "I'll swear she doesn't," said Richard positively. "It'll be a bit of a startler for the old girl." "No doubt you've heard," said Eva haltingly, "that Mr. Loggerheads has cast eyes on Mary." "And do you think there's anything in that?" Richard questioned sharply. "Well," she said, "I really don't know." Meaning that she had decidedly thought that Mary had been encouraging advances from Mr. Loggerheads. "Well," said Richard superiorly, "you may just take it from me that there's nothing in it at all." He laughed shortly. He knew Mary. Then they got on a car and tried to behave as though their being together was a mere accident, as though they had not become engaged to one another within the previous 24 hours. 2. Immediately after the departure of Richard Morfe and Eva Harracles, his betrothed, from the front door of the former, Mr. Simon Loggerheads arrived at the same front door, and rang thereat, and was a little surprised and also a little unnerved when the door opened instantly, as if by magic. Mr. Simon Loggerheads said to himself, as he saw the door move on its hinges, that Miss Morfe must have discovered a treasure of a servant who, when she had nothing else to do, spent her time on the inner doormat, waiting to admit possible visitors, even on a Friday night. Nevertheless, Mr. Simon Loggerheads regretted that prompt opening, as one regrets the prompt opening of the door of a dentist. And it was no servant who stood in front of him under the flickering beam of the lobby lamp. It was Mary Morfe herself. The simple explanation was that she had just sped her brother and Eva Harracles, and had remained in the lobby for the purpose of ascertaining, by means of her finger, whether the servant had, as usual, forgotten to dust the tops of the picture frames. "Oh," said Mr. Loggerheads when he saw Mary Morfe. For the cashier of the Bursley branch of the Birmingham and Sheffield Bank it was not a very able speech, but it was all he could accomplish. And Miss Mary Morfe said, "Oh!" She was 38, and he was quite that, for the bank mentioned does not elevate its men to the august situation of cashier under less than 20 years' service. And yet they neither of them had enough worldliness to behave in a reasonable manner. Then Miss Morfe, to whom it did at last occur that something must be done, produced an invitation. "Do come in." And she added, "Richard has just gone out." "Oh!" commented Mr. Simon Loggerheads again. After all, it must be admitted that tenors, as a class, have never been noted for their conversational powers. But he was obviously more at ease, and he went in, and Mary Morfe shut the door. At this very instant her brother and Eva were in secret converse at the back end of Beech Street. "Do take your coat off," Mary suggested to Simon. Simultaneously the servant appeared at the kitchen extremity of the lobby, and Mary thrust her out of sight again with the cold words, "It's all right, Susan." Mr. Loggerheads took his coat off, and Mary Morfe watched him as he did so. He made a pretty figure. He was something of a dandy. The lapels of the overcoat would have shown that, not to mention the correctly severe necktie. All his clothes, in fact, had cut and style, even to his boots. In the Five Towns many a young man is a dandy down to the edge of his trousers, but not down to the ground. Mr. Loggerheads looked a young man. The tranquillity of his career and the quietude of his tastes had preserved his youthfulness. And further, he had the air of a successful, solid, much respected individual. To be a cashier, though worthy, is not to be a nabob, but a bachelor can save a lot out of over 20 years of regular salary. And Mr. Loggerheads had saved quite a lot. And he had opportunities of advantageously investing his savings. Then everybody knew him, and he knew everybody. He handed out gold at least once a week to nearly half the town, and you cannot help venerating a man who makes a practice of handing out gold to you. And he had thrilled thousands with the wistful beauty of his voice in "The Sands of Dee." In a word, Simon Loggerheads was a personage, if not talkative. They went into the drawing-room. Mary Morfe closed the door gently. Simon Loggerheads strolled vaguely and self-consciously up to the fireplace, murmuring, "So he's gone out?" "Yes," said Mary Morfe, in confirmation of her first statement. "I'm sorry," said Simon Loggerheads. A statement which was absolutely contrary to the truth. Simon Loggerheads was deeply relieved and glad that Richard Morfe was out. The pair, aged slightly under and slightly over 40, seemed to hover for a fraction of a second uncertainly near each other. And then, somehow, mysteriously, Simon Loggerheads had kissed Mary Morfe. She blushed. He blushed. The kiss was repeated. Mary gazed up at him. Mary could scarcely believe that he was hers. She could scarcely believe that, on the previous evening, he had proposed marriage to her. Rather suddenly, so it seemed to her, but delightfully. She could comprehend his conduct no better than her own. They two stayed settled down, both of them old maids, falling in love and behaving like lunatics. Mary, a year ago, would have been ready to prophesy that if ever Simon Loggerheads, at his age, did marry, he would assuredly marry something young, something ingenuous, something cream and rose, probably something with rich parents. For 20 years Simon Loggerheads had been marked down for capture by the marriageable spinsters and widows and the mothers with daughters of Bursley. And he had evaded capture, despite the special temptations to which any after-dinner tenor is necessarily subject. And now Mary Morfe had caught him. Caught him, moreover, without having had the slightest intention of catching him. She was one of the most spinsterish spinsters in the Five Towns, and she had often said things about men and marriage, of which the recollection now, as an affianced woman, was very disturbing to her. However, she did not care. She did not understand how Simon Loggerheads had had the wit to perceive that she would be an ideal wife. And she did not care. She did not understand how, as a result of Simon Loggerheads falling in love with her, she had fallen in love with him. And she did not care. She did not care a fig for anything. She was in love with him, and he with her, and she was idiotically joyous. And so was he. And that was all. On reflection, I have to admit that she did in fact care for one thing. That one thing was the look on her brother's face when he should learn that she, the faithful, sardonic sister, having incomprehensibly become indispensable and all in all to a bank cashier, meant to desert him. She was afraid of that look. She trembled at the forevision of it. Still, Richard had to be informed, and the world had to be informed, for the silken dalliance between Mary and Simon had been conducted with a discretion and a secrecy more than characteristic of their age and dispositions. It had been arranged between the lovers that Simon should call on that Friday evening, when he would be sure to catch Richard in his easy chair, and should, in presence of Mary, bluntly communicate to Richard the blunt fact. "What's he gone out for? Anything special?" asked Simon. Mary explained the circumstances. "The truth is," she finished, "that girl is just throwing herself at Dick's head. There's no doubt of it. I never saw such work." "Well," said Simon Loggerheads, "of course, you know, there has been a certain amount of talk about them. Some folk say that your brother began "And do you believe that?" demanded Mary. "I don't know," said Simon. By which he meant, diplomatically, to convey that he had had a narrow escape of believing it, at any rate. "Well," said Mary with conviction, "you may take it from me that it isn't so. I know Dick. Eva Harracles may throw herself at his head until there's no breath left in her body, and it'll make no difference to Dick. Do you see Dick a married man? I don't. I only wish he would take it in his head to get married. It would make me much easier in my mind. But all the same, I do think it's downright wicked that a girl should fling herself at him. Right at him. Fancy her calling to-night. It's the sort of thing that oughtn't to be encouraged." "But I understood you to say that you yourself had told him to see her home," Simon Loggerheads put in. "Isn't that encouraging her, as it were?" "Ah," said Mary with a smile, "I only suggested it to him because it came over me all of a sudden how nice it would be to have you here all alone. He can't be back much before 12." To such a remark there is but one response. A sofa is, after all, made for two people, and the chance of the servant calling on them was small. "And so the clock stopped," observed Simon Loggerheads. "Yes," said Mary. "If it hadn't been for the sheer accident of that clock stopping, we shouldn't be sitting here on the sofa now, and Dick would be in that chair, and you would just be beginning to tell him that we're engaged." She sighed. "Ah, poor Dick! What on earth will he do?" "Strange how things happen," Simon reflected in a low voice. "But I'm really surprised at that clock stopping like that. It's a clock that you ought to be able to depend on, that clock is." He got up to inspect the timepiece. He knew all about the clock, because he had been chairman of the presentation committee, which had gone into Manchester to buy it. "Why," he murmured, after he had toyed a little with the pendulum, "it goes all right. Its tick is as right as rain." "How odd!" responded Mary. Simon Loggerheads set the clock by his own impeccable watch, and then sat down again. And he drew something from his waistcoat pocket and slid it on to Mary's finger. Mary regarded her finger in silent ecstasy, and then breathed, "How lovely!" not meaning her finger. "Shall I stay till he comes back?" asked Simon. "If I were you, I shouldn't do that," said Mary. "But you can safely stay till 11:30. Then I shall go to bed. He'll be tired and short when he gets back. I'll tell him myself to morrow morning at breakfast, and you might come to morrow afternoon early for tea." Simon did stay till 11:30. He left precisely when the clock, now convalescent, struck the half hour. At the door Mary said to him: "I won't have any secrets from you, Simon. It was I who stopped that clock." I stopped it while they were bending down looking for music. I wanted to be sure as I could of a good excuse for me suggesting that he ought to take her home. I just wanted to get him out of the house." "But why?" asked Simon. "I must leave that to you to guess," said Mary, with a hint of tartness, but smiling. Loggerheads and Richard Morfe met in Trafalgar Road. "Good night, Morfe." "Night, Loggerheads." And each passed on without having stopped. You can picture for yourself the breakfast of the brother and sister. End of section 17. Section 18 of The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Andy Minter. The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories by Arnold Bennett. Section 18. Hot Potatoes. 1. It was considered by certain people to be a dramatic moment in the history of music enterprise in the Five Towns when Mrs Swann opened the front door of her house in Bleakridge in the early darkness of a November evening and let forth her son Gilbert. Gilbert's age was 19, and he was wearing evening dress, a form of raiment that had not hitherto happened to him. Over the elegant suit was his winter overcoat, making him bulky, and round what may be called the rim of the overcoat was a white woollen scarf, and the sleeves of the overcoat were finished off with white woollen gloves. Under one arm he carried a vast inanimate form, whose extremity just escaped the ground. This form was his 'cello, fragile as a pretty woman, ungainly as a navvy, and precious as honour. Mrs Swann looked down the street, which ended to the east in darkness and a marl pit, and up the street, which ended to the west in Trafalgar Road and electric cars, and she shivered, though she had a shawl over her independent little shoulders. In the Five Towns, and probably elsewhere, when a woman puts her head out of her front door, she always looks first to right and then to left, like a scouting Iroquois. And if the air nips, she shivers, not because she's cold, but merely to express herself. "For goodness sake, keep your hands warm," Mrs Swann enjoined her son. "Oh!" said Gilbert, with scornful lightness, as though his playing had never suffered from cold hands. "It's quite warm to night," which it was not. "And mind what you eat," added his mother. "There, I can hear the car." He hurried up the street. The electric tram slid in thunder down Trafalgar Road and stopped for him with a jar, and he gingerly climbed into it, practising all precautions on behalf of his 'cello. The car slid away again towards Bursley, making blue sparks. Mrs Swann stared mechanically at the flickering gas in her lobby, and then closed her front door. He was gone. The boy was gone. Now, the people who considered the boy's departure to be a dramatic moment in the history of musical enterprise in the Five Towns were Mrs Swann chiefly, and the boy secondly. 2. And more than the moment, the day, nay, the whole week, was dramatic in the history of local musical enterprise. It had occurred to somebody in Hanbridge about a year before that since York, Norwich, Hereford, Gloucester, Birmingham, and even Blackpool had their musical festivals, the Five Towns too ought to have its musical festival. The Five Towns possessed a larger population than any of these centres, save Birmingham, and it was notorious for its love of music. Choirs from the Five Towns had gone to all sorts of places, such as Brecon, Aberystwyth, the Crystal Palace, and even a place called Hull, and had come back with first prizes, cups and banners, for the singing of choruses and part songs. There were 3, or at least 2.5, rival choirs in Hanbridge alone. Then, also, the brass band contests were famously attended. In the Five Towns the number of cornet players is scarcely exceeded by the number of public houses. Hence the feeling, born and fanned into lustiness at Hanbridge, that the Five Towns owed it to its self-respect to have a musical festival like the rest of the world. Men who had never heard of Wagner, men who could not have told the difference between a sonata and a sonnet to save their souls, Men who spent all their lives in manufacturing teacups or china doorknobs were invited to guarantee £5 apiece against possible loss on the festival, and they bravely and blindly did so. The conductor of the largest Hanbridge choir, being appointed to conduct the preliminary rehearsals of the festival chorus, had an acute attack of self-importance, which, by the way, almost ended fatally a year later. Double-crown posters appeared magically on all the hoardings, announcing that a festival, consisting of 3 evening and 2 morning concerts, would be held in the Alexandra Hall at Hanbridge on the 6th, 7th, and 8th of November, and that the box plan could be consulted at the principal stationers. The Alexandra Hall contained no boxes whatever, but box plan was the phrase sacred to the occasion and had to be used. And the festival more and more impregnated the air and took the lion's share of the columns of the Staffordshire Signal. Every few days the Signal reported progress, even to intimate biographical details of the singers engaged and of the composers to be performed, together with analyses of the latter's works. And at last the week itself had dawned in exhilaration and excitement. And early on the day before the opening day, John Merazzi, the renowned conductor, and Herbert Millwain, the renowned leader of the orchestra, and the renowned orchestra itself, all arrived from London. And finally, sundry musical critics arrived from the offices of sundry London dailies. The presence of these latter convinced an awed population that its festival was a real festival, and not a local make-believe. And it also tranquillized in some degree the exasperating and disconcerting effect of a telegram from the capricious Countess of Chell, who had taken 6 balcony seats, and was the official advertised high patroness of the festival, announcing at the last moment that she could not attend. 3. Mrs Swann's justification for considering, as she did in fact consider, that her son was either the base or the apex of the splendid pyramid of the festival, lay in the following facts. From earliest infancy, Gilbert had been a musical prodigy, and the circle of his fame had constantly been extending. He could play the piano with his hands before his legs were long enough for him to play it with his feet, that is to say, before he could use the pedals. A spectacle formerly familiar to the delighted friends of the Swanns was Gilbert, in a pinafore and curls, seated on a high chair, topped with a large Bible and a bound volume of the Graphic, playing Home Sweet Home, with Thalberg's variations, while his mother, standing by his side on her right foot, put the loud pedal on or off with her left foot, according to the infant's whispered orders. He had been allowed to play from ear, playing from ear being deemed especially marvellous, until some expert told Mrs Swann that playing solely from ear was a practice to be avoided if she wished her son to fulfil the promise of his babyhood. Then he had lessons at night until he began to teach his teacher. Then he said he would learn the fiddle, and he did learn the fiddle, also the viola. He did not pretend to play the flute, although he could. And at school the other boys would bring him their penny or even sixpenny whistles, so that he might show them of what a wonderful feats a common tin whistle is capable. Mr Swann was secretary for the Toft End Brickworks and Colliery Company, Limited. Mr Swann had passed the whole of his career in the offices of the prosperous Toft End Company, and his imagination did not move freely beyond the company's premises. He had certainly intended that Gilbert should follow in his steps. Perhaps he meant to establish a dynasty of Swanns, in which the secretaryship of the 20% paying company should descend for ever from father to son. But Gilbert's astounding facility in music had shaken even this resolve, and Gilbert had been allowed at the age of 15 to enter, as an assistant, the shop of Mr James Otkinson, the piano and musical instrument dealer and music seller in Crown Square, Hanbridge. Here, of course, he found himself in a musical atmosphere. Here he had at once established a reputation for showing off the merits of a piano, a song, or a waltz, to customers, male and female. Here he had 30 pianos, 7 harmoniums, and all the new and a lot of classical music to experiment with. He would play any piece at sight for the benefit of any lady in search of a nice easy waltz or reverie. Unfortunately, ladies would complain that the pieces proved much more difficult at home than they had seemed under the fingers of Gilbert in the shop. Here, too, he began to give lessons on the piano, and here he satisfied his secret ambition to learn the cello, Mr. Hopkinson having in stock a cello that had never found a proper customer. His progress with the cello had been such that the theatre people offered him an engagement, which his father and his own sense of the enormous respectability of the Swans compelled him to refuse. But he always played in the band of the Five Towns Amateur Operatic Society, and was beloved by its conductor for being utterly reliable. His connection with the choirs started through his merits as a rehearsal accompanist, who could keep time and make his bass chords heard against 150 voices. He had been appointed, nem.con., rehearsal accompanist to the festival chorus. He knew the entire festival music, backwards and upside down, and his modestly expressed desire to add his cello as one of the local reinforcements to the London orchestra had been almost eagerly complied with by the advisory committee. Nor was this all. He had been invited to dinner by Mrs. Clayton Vernon, the social leader of Bursley. In the affair of the festival, Mrs. Clayton Vernon loomed larger than even she really was, and this was due to an accident, to a sheer bit of luck on her part. She happened to be a cousin of Mr. Herbert Millwain, the leader of the orchestra down from London. Mrs. Clayton Vernon knew no more about music than she knew about the North Pole, and cared no more. But she was Mr. Millwain's cousin, and Mr. Millwain had naturally to stay at her house. And she came in her carriage to fetch him from the band rehearsals, and, in short, any one might have thought from her self-satisfied demeanour, though she was a decent sort of woman at heart, that she had at least composed a Judas Maccabeus. It was at a band rehearsal that she had graciously commanded Gilbert Swann to come and dine with her and Mr. Millwain between the final rehearsal and the opening concert. This invitation was, as it were, the overflowing drop in Mrs. Swann's cup. It was proof to her that Mr. Millwain had instantly pronounced Gilbert to be the equal of London cellists, and perhaps their superior. It was proof to her that Mr. Millwain relied on him particularly to maintain the honour of the band in the festival. Gilbert had dashed home from the final rehearsal, and his mother had helped him with the unfamiliarities of evening dress, while he gave her a list of all the places in the music where, as he said, the band was "rocky," and especially the cellos, and a further list of all the smart musical things that the players from London had said to him, and he had said to them. He simply knew everything from the inside, and not even the great Marazzi, the conductor, was more familiar with the music than he. And the ineffable Mrs. Clayton Vernon had asked him to dinner with Mr. Millwain. It was indubitable to Mrs. Swann that all the festival rested on her son's shoulders. 4. "It's freezing, I think," said Mr. Swann when he came home at 6 o'clock from his day's majestic work at Toft End. This was in the bedroom. Mrs. Swann, a comely little thing of 39, was making herself resplendent for the inaugural solemnity of the festival, which began at 8. The news of the frost disturbed her. "How annoying!" she said. "Annoying?" he questioned blandly. "Why?" "Now, you needn't put on any of your airs, John," she snapped. She had a curt way with her at critical times. "You know as well as I do that I'm thinking of Gilbert's hands." "No, you must wear your frock coat, of course. All that drive from the other end of the town right to Hanbridge in a carriage. Perhaps outside the carriage because of the cello. There'll never be room for two of them, and the cello, and Mrs. Clayton Vernon in her carriage. And he can't keep his hands in his pockets because of holding the cello. And he's bound to pretend he isn't cold. He's so silly. And yet he knows perfectly well he won't do himself justice if his hands are cold. Don't you remember last year at the Town Hall?" "Oh, well," said Mr. Swann, we can't do anything anyway, so we must hope for the best." "That's all very well," said Mrs. Swann. And it was. Shortly afterwards, perfect in most details of her black silk, she left the bedroom, requesting her husband to be quick, as tea was ready. And she came into the little dining room, where the youthful servant was poking up the fire. "Jane," she said, "put 2 medium-sized potatoes in the oven to bake." "Potatoes, ma'am?" "Yes, potatoes." said Mrs. Swann, tartly. It was an idea of pure genius that had suddenly struck her, the genius of common sense. She somewhat hurried the tea, and then rang. "Jane," she inquired, "are those potatoes ready?" "Potatoes!" exclaimed Mr. Swann. "Yes, hot potatoes," said Mrs. Swann, tartly. "I am going to run up with them by car to Mrs. Vernon's. I can slip them quietly over to Gil. They keep your hands warm better than anything. Don't I remember when I was a child? I shall leave Mrs. Vernon's immediately, of course, but perhaps you'd better give me my ticket, and I will meet you at the hall. Don't you think it's the best plan, John?" "As you like," said Mr. Swann, with the force of habit. He was supreme in most things, but in the practical details of their son's life and comfort she was supreme. Her decision in such matters had never been questioned. Mr. Swann had a profound belief in his wife as a uniquely capable and energetic woman. He was tremendously loyal to her, and he sternly inculcated the same loyalty to her in Gilbert. 5. Just as the car had stopped at the end of the street for Gilbert and his 'cello, so, more than an hour later, it stopped for Mrs. Swann and her hot potatoes. They were hot potatoes, nay, very hot potatoes, of a medium size, because Mrs. Swann's recollection of youth had informed her that if a potato is too large, one cannot get one's fingers well round it, and if it is too small, it cools somewhat rapidly. She had taken two, not in the hope that Gilbert would be able to use two at once, for one cannot properly nurse either a baby or a 'cello with two hands full of potatoes, but rather to provide against accident. Besides, the inventive boy might, after all, find a way of using both simultaneously, which would be all the better for his playing at the concert, and hence all the better for the success of the music festival. It never occurred to Mrs. Swann that she was doing anything in the least unusual. There she was, in her best boots, and her best dress, and her best hat, and her sealskin mantle, not easily to be surpassed in the town, and her muff to match, nearly. And concealed in the muff were the two very hot potatoes. And it did not strike her that women of fashion like herself, wives of secretaries of flourishing companies, do not commonly go about with hot potatoes concealed on their persons. For she was a self-confident woman, and after a decision she did not reflect, nor did she heed minor consequences. She was always sure that what she was doing was the right and the only thing to do. And to give her justice, it was, for her direct, abrupt common sense was indeed remarkable. The act of climbing up into the car warned her that she must be skilful in the control of these potatoes. One of them nearly fell out of the right end of her muff as she grasped the car rail with her right hand. She had to let go and save the potato, and began again while the car waited. The conductor took her for one of those hesitating, hysterical women who are the bane of car conductors. "Now, missus," he said, "up with you." But she did not care what manner of woman the conductor took her for. The car was nearly full of people going home from their work, of people actually going in a direction contrary to the direction of the music festival. She sat down among them, shocked by the indifference to the musical festival. At the back of her head had been an idea that all the cars for Hanbridge would be crammed to the step, and all the cars from Hanbridge forlorn and empty. She had vaguely imagined that the thoughts of 250,000 of people would that evening be centred on the unique music festival. And she was shocked also by the conversation. Not that it was in the slightest degree improper, but because it displayed no interest whatsoever in the musical festival. And yet there were several festival advertisements adhering to the roof of the car. Travellers were discussing football, soap, the weather, trade. Travellers were dozing. Travellers were reading about starting prices, but not one seemed to be occupied with the musical festival. Nevertheless, she reflected with consoling pride, if they knew that our Gilbert was playing 'cello in the orchestra and dining at this very moment with Mr. Millwain, some of them would be fine and surprised. That they would. No one would ever have suspected from her calm, careless, proud face that such vain and twopenny thoughts were passing through her head. But the thoughts that do pass through the heads of even the most common-sense philosophers, men and women, are truly astonishing. In 4 minutes she was at Bursley Town Hall, where she changed into another car, full of people, equally indifferent to the musical festival, for the suburbs of Hillport, where Mrs Clayton Vernon lived. "Put me out opposite Mrs Clayton Vernon's, will you?" she said to the conductor, and added, "You know the house?" He nodded, as if to say disdainfully, in response to such a needless question, "Do I know the house? Do I know my pocket?" As she left the car she did catch two men discussing the festival, but they appeared to have no intention of attending it. They were earthenware manufacturers. One of them raised his hat to her, and she said to herself, "He, at any rate, knows how important my Gilbert is in the festival." It was at the instant that she pushed open Mrs Clayton Vernon's long and heavy garden gate, and crunched in the frosty darkness up the short winding drive, that the notion of the peculiarity of her errand first presented itself to her. Mrs Clayton Vernon was a relatively great lady, living in a relatively great house, one of the few exalted or peculiar ones who did not dine in the middle of the day like other folk. Mrs Clayton Vernon had the grand manner. Mrs Clayton Vernon instinctively and successfully patronized everybody. Mrs Clayton Vernon was a personage with whom people did not joke. And lo, Mrs Swann was about to invade her courtly and luxurious house, uninvited, unauthorized, with a couple of hot potatoes in her muff. What would Mrs Clayton Vernon think of hot potatoes in a muff? Of course, the Swanns were as good as anybody. The Swanns knelt before nobody. The Swanns were of the cream of the town, combining commerce with art. And why should not Mrs Swann take practical measures to keep her son's hands warm in Mrs Clayton Vernon's gold carriage? Still, there was only one Mrs Clayton Vernon in Bursley, and it was impossible to deny that she inspired awe, even in the independent soul of Mrs Swann. Mrs Swann rang the bell, reassuring herself. The next instant electric light miraculously came into existence outside the door, illuminating her from head to foot. This startled her, but she said to herself that it must be the latest dodge, and that at any rate it was a very good dodge, and she began again the process of reassuring herself. The door opened, and a prim creature, stiffly starched, stood before Mrs Swann. My word, reflected Mrs Swann, she must cost her mistress a pretty penny for getting up aprons. And she said aloud curtly, "Will you please tell Mr Gilbert Swann that someone wants to speak to him a moment at the door?" "Yes," said the servant with pert civility. "Will you please step in?" She had not meant to step in. She had decidedly meant not to step in, for she had no wish to encounter Mrs Clayton Vernon. Indeed, the reverse. But she immediately perceived that, in asking to speak to a guest at the door, she had socially erred. At Mrs Clayton Vernon's, refined people did not speak to refined people at the door. So she stepped in, and the door was closed, prisoning her and her potatoes in the imposing hall. "I only want to see Mr Gilbert Swann," she insisted. "Yes," said the servant. "Will you please step into the breakfast room? There's no one there. I will tell Mr Swann." 6. As Mrs Swann was being led like a sheep out of the hall into an apartment on the right, which the servant styled the breakfast room, another door opened further up the hall, and Mrs Clayton Vernon appeared. Magnificent though Mrs Swann was, the ample Mrs Clayton Vernon, discreetly décolletée, was even more magnificent. Dressed as she meant to show herself at the concert, Mrs Clayton Vernon made a resplendent figure worthy to be the cousin of the leader of the orchestra, and worthy even to take the place of the missing Countess of Chell. Mrs Clayton Vernon had a lorgnon at the end of a shaft of tortoiseshell, otherwise a pair of eyeglasses on a stick. She had the habit of the lorgnon. The lorgnon seldom left her, and whenever she was in any doubt or difficulty, she would raise the lorgnon to her eyes and stare patronizingly. It was a gesture tremendously effective. She employed it now on Mrs Swann, as who should say, "Who is this insignificant and scarcely visible creature that has got into my noble hall?" Mrs Swann stopped, struck into immobility by the basilisk glance. A courageous and even a defiant woman, Mrs Swann was taken aback. She could not possibly tell Mrs Clayton Vernon that she was the bearer of hot potatoes to her son. She scarcely knew Mrs Clayton Vernon, had only met her once at a bazaar. With a convulsive, unconscious movement, her right hand clenched nervously within her muff. and crushed the rich, mealy potato it held until the flesh of the potato was forced between the fingers of her glove, a horrible sticky mess. That's the worst of a high-class potato, cooked, as the Five Towns phrase it, in its jacket. It will burst on the least provocation. There stood Mrs Swann, her right hand glued up with escaped potato, in the sober grandeur of Mrs Clayton Vernon's hall, and Mrs Clayton Vernon bearing down upon her like a dreadnought. Steam actually began to emerge from her muff. "Ah!" said Mrs Clayton Vernon, inspecting Mrs Swann. "It's Mrs Swann. How do you do, Mrs Swann?" She seemed politely astonished, as well she might be. By a happy chance she did not perceive the wisp of steam. She was not looking for steam. People do not expect steam from the interior of a visitor's muff. "Oh!" said Mrs Swann, who was really in a pitiable state. "I'm terribly sorry to trouble you, Mrs Clayton Vernon, but I want to speak to Gilbert for one moment." She then saw that Mrs Clayton Vernon's hand was graciously extended. She could not take it with her right hand, which was fully engaged with the extremely heated sultriness of the ruined potato. She could not refuse it, or ignore it. She therefore offered her left hand, which Mrs Clayton Vernon pressed with a well-bred pretence that people always offered her their left hands. "Nothing wrong, I do hope?" said she, gravely. "Oh, no," said Mrs Swann. "Only just a little matter which I'd forgotten. Only half a minute. I must hurry off at once, as I have to meet my husband. If I could just see Gilbert." "Certainly," said Mrs Clayton Vernon. "Do come into the breakfast room, will you? We've just finished dinner. We had it very early, of course, for the concert. Mr Millwain, my cousin, hates to be hurried. Maria, be good enough to ask Mr Swann to come here. Tell him that his mother wishes to speak to him." In the breakfast room Mrs Swann was invited, nay, commanded, by Mrs Clayton Vernon to loosen her mantle. But she could not loosen her mantle. She could do nothing. In clutching the potato to prevent bits of it from falling out of the muff, she of course effected the precise opposite of her purpose, and bits of the luscious and perfect potato began to descend the front of her mantle. The clock struck 7, and ages elapsed, during which Mrs Swann could not think of anything whatever to say, but the finger of the clock somehow stuck motionlessly at 7, though the pendulum plainly wagged. "I'm not too warm," she said at length, feebly but obstinately resisting Mrs Clayton Vernon's command. This, to speak bluntly, was an untruth. She was too warm. "Are you sure that nothing is the matter?" urged Mrs Clayton Vernon, justifiably alarmed by the expression of her visitor's features. "I beg you to confide in me if—" "Not at all," said Mrs Swann, trying to laugh. I'm only sorry to disturb you. I didn't mean to disturb you." "What on earth is that?" cried Mrs Clayton Vernon. The other potato, escaping Mrs Swann's vigilance, had run out of the muff and come to the carpet with a dull thud. It rolled under Mrs Swann's dress. Almost hysterically she put her foot on it, thus making pulp of the second potato. What?" she inquired innocently. "Didn't you hear anything? I trust it isn't a mouse. We had them once." Mrs Clayton Vernon thought how brave Mrs Swann was not to be frightened by the word mouse. I didn't hear anything," said Mrs Swann. Another untruth. "If you aren't too warm, won't you come a little nearer the fire?" But not for £1,000 would Mrs Swann have exposed the mush of potato on the carpet under her feet. She could not conceive in what ignominy the dreadful affair would end, but she was the kind of woman that nails her colours to the mast. "Dear me," Mrs Clayton Vernon murmured, "how delicious those potatoes do smell! I can smell them all over the house." This was the most staggering remark that Mrs Swann had ever heard. "Potatoes?" very weakly. "Yes," said Mrs Clayton Vernon, smiling. "I must tell you that Mr Millwain is very nervous about getting his hands cold in driving to Hanbridge, and he has asked me to have hot potatoes prepared. Isn't it amusing? It seems hot potatoes are constantly used for this purpose in winter by the pupils of the Royal College of Music, and even by the professors. My cousin says that even a slight chilliness of the hands interferes with his playing. So I am having potatoes done for your son too.
A delightful boy he is." "Really," said Mrs Swann. "How queer! But what a good idea!" She might have confessed then, but you do not know her if you think she did. Gilbert came in, anxious and alarmed. Mrs Clayton Vernon left them together. The mother explained matters to the son, and in an instant of time the ruin of two magnificent potatoes was at the back of the fire. Then, without saluting Mrs Clayton Vernon, Mrs Swann fled. End of section 18. Section 19 of The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Andy Minter. The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories by Arnold, Bennett. Section 19. Half a sovereign. The scene was the up platform of Knype railway station on a summer afternoon, and more particularly that part of the platform round about the bookstall. There were three persons in the neighbourhood of the bookstall. The first was the principal bookstall clerk, who was folding with extraordinary rapidity copies of the special edition of the Staffordshire Signal. The second was Mr Sandbach, an earthenware manufacturer, famous throughout the Five Towns for the ingenious invention of teapots that will pour the tea into the cup instead of all over the table, and a very shabby man whom Mr Sandbach did not know. This very shabby man was quite close to the bookstall, while Mr Sandbach stood quite 10 yards away. Mr Sandbach gazed steadily at the man, but the man, ignoring Mr Sandbach, allowed dreamy and abstracted eyes to rest on the far distance, where a locomotive or so was impatiently pushing and pulling waggons, as an excitable mother will drag and shove an inoffensive child. The platform as a whole was sparsely peopled. The London train had recently departed, and the station was suffering from the usual reaction. Only a local train was signalled. Mr Gale, a friend of Mr Sandbach's, came briskly on to the platform from the booking office, caught sight of Mr Sandbach, and accosted him. "Hello, Sandbach. How do, Gale?" To a slight extent they were rivals in the field of invention, but both had succeeded in life, and both had the alert and prosperous air of success. Born about the same time, they stood nearly equal after 40 years of earthly endeavour. "What are you doing here?" asked Gale casually. "I've come to meet someone off the crew train." "And I'm going by it to Derby," said Mr Gale. "They say it's 13 minutes late." "Look here," said Mr Sandbach, taking no notice of this remark. "You see that man there?" "Which one? By the bookstall?" "Yes." "Well, what about him?" "I bet you that you can't make him move from where he is. No physical force, of course." Mr Gale hesitated an instant, and then his eye glistened with response to the challenge, and he replied: "I bet I can." "Well, try," said Mr Sandbach. Mr Sandbach and Mr Gale frequently threw down the glove to each other in this agreeable way. Either they asked conundrums, or they set test questions, or they suggested feats. When Mr Sandbach discovered at a Christmas party that you cannot stand with your left side close against a wall and then lift your right leg, his first impulse was to confront Mr Gale with the trick. When Mr Gale read in a facetious paper an article on the lack of accurate observation in the average man, entitled "Do Bus Horses Wear Blinkers?" his opening remark to Mr Sandbach at their next meeting was: "I say, Sandbach, do bus horses wear blinkers? Answer quick." And a phrase constantly in their mouths was: "I'll try that on Gale," or "I wonder whether Sandbach knows that." All that was required to make their relations artistically complete was an official referee for counting the scores. Such a basis of friendship may seem bizarre, but it is by no means uncommon in the Five Towns, and perhaps elsewhere. So that when Mr Sandbach defied Mr Gale to induce the shabby man to move from where he stood, The nostrils of the combatants twitched with the scent of battle. Mr. Gale conceived his tactics instantly, and put them into execution. He walked along the platform some little distance, then turned, and, taking a handful of silver from his pocket, began to count it. He passed slowly by the shabby man, almost brushing his shoulder, and just as he passed he let fall half a crown. The half crown rolled round in a circle, and lay down within a yard and a half of the shabby man. The shabby man calmly glanced at the half crown, and then at Mr. Gale, who, strolling on magnificently, pretended to be unaware of his loss. And then the shabby man resumed his dreamy stare into the distance. "Hi!" cried Mr. Sandbach after Mr. Gale. "You've dropped something." It was a great triumph for Mr. Sandbach. "I told you wouldn't get him to move," said Mr. Sandbach proudly, having rejoined his friend at another part of the platform. "What's the game?" demanded Mr. Gale, frankly acknowledging by tone and gesture that he was defeated. "Perfectly simple," answered Mr. Sandbach condescendingly. "When you know. I'll tell you. It's really very funny. Just as everyone was rushing to get into the London express, I heard a coin drop on the platform, and I saw it rolling. It was half a sovereign. I couldn't be sure who dropped it, but I think it was a lady. Anyhow, no one claimed it. I was just going to pick it up when that chap came by. He saw it, and he put his foot on it, quick as lightning, and stood still. He didn't notice that I was after it too, so I drew back. I thought I'd wait and see what happens." "He looks as if he could do with half a sovereign," said Mr. Gale. "Yes, he's only a station loafer." "Then why doesn't he pick up his half sovereign and hook it?" "Can't you see why?" said Mr. Sandbach patronisingly. "He's afraid of the bookstall clerk catching him at it. He's afraid it's the bookstall clerk that has dropped that half sovereign. You wait till the bookstall clerk finishes those papers and goes inside, and you'll see." At this point Mr. Gale made the happy involuntary movement of a man who has suddenly thought of something rather brilliant. "Look here," said he. "You said you'd bet, but you didn't bet. I'll bet you a level half crown I get him to shift this time." "But you mustn't say anything to him." "No, of course not." "Very well, I'll bet you." Mr. Gale walked straight up to the shabby man, drew half a sovereign from his waistcoat pocket, and held it out. At the same time he pointed to the shabby man's boots, and then, in the most unmistakable way, he pointed to the exit of the platform. He said nothing, but his gestures were expressive, and what they clearly expressed was: "I know you've got a half sovereign under your foot. Here's another half sovereign for you to clear off and ask no questions." Meanwhile, the ingenious offerer of the half sovereign was meditating thus: "I give half a sovereign, but I shall gather up the other half sovereign, and I shall also win my bet. Net result, half a crown to the good." The shabby man, who could not have been a fool, comprehended at once, accepted the half sovereign, and moved leisurely away. Not, however, without glancing at the ground which his feet had covered. The result of the scrutiny evidently much surprised him, as it surprised in a degree equally violent both Mr. Gale and Mr. Sandbach, for there was no sign of the half sovereign under the feet of the shabby man. There was not even 9 11 there. Mr. Gale looked up very angry, and Mr. Sandbach looked very foolish. "This is all very well," Mr. Gale exploded in tones low and fierce, "but I call it a swindle." And he walked with an undecided longing, shrinking air in the wake of the shabby man who had pocketed his half sovereign. "I'm sure I saw him put his foot on it," said Mr. Sandbach in defence of himself, meaning of course the other half sovereign, "and I've never taken my eyes off him." "Well, then, how do you explain it?" "I don't explain it," said Mr. Sandbach. "I think some explanation is due to me," said Mr. Gale, with a peculiar and dangerous intonation, "if this is your notion of a practical joke." "There was no practical joke about it at all," Mr. Sandbach protested. "If the half sovereign has disappeared, it's not my fault. I made a bet with you, and I've lost it. Here's your half crown." He produced 2 and 6, which Mr. Gale accepted, though he had a strange impulse to decline it with an air of offended pride. "I'm still 7 and 6 out," said Mr. Gale. "And if you are," snapped Mr. Sandbach, "you thought you'd do me down by a trick. Offering the man 10 shillings to go wasn't at all a fair way of winning the bet, and you knew it, my boy. However, I've paid up, so that's all right." "All I say is," Mr. Gale obstinately repeated, "if this is your notion of a practical joke " "Didn't I tell you?" Mr. Sandbach became icily furious. The friendship hitherto existing between these two excellent individuals might have been ruined and annihilated for a comparative trifle, had not a surprising and indeed almost miraculous thing happened, by some freak of destiny, in the nick of time. Mr. Sandbach was sticking close to Mr. Gale, and Mr. Gale was following in the leisurely footsteps of the very shabby man, possibly debating within himself whether he should boldly demand the return of his half sovereign, when lo! a golden coin seemed to slip from the boot of the very shabby man. It took the stone flags of the platform with scarcely a sound, and Mr. Sandbach and Mr. Gale made a simultaneous superb and undignified rush for it. Mr. Sandbach got it. The very shabby man passed on, passed eternally out of the lives of the other two. It may be said that he was of too oblivious and dreamy a nature for this world, but one must not forget that he had made a solid gain of 10 shillings. "The soles of the fellow's boots must have been all cracks, and it must have got lodged in one of them," cheerfully explained Mr. Sandbach, as he gazed with pleasure at the coin. "I hope you believe me now. You thought it was a plant. I hope you believe me now." Mr. Gale made no response to this remark. What Mr. Gale said was, "Now, don't you think that, in fairness, that half sovereign belongs to me?" "Why?" asked Mr. Sandbach bluntly. "Well," Mr. Gale began, searching about for a reason. "You didn't find it," Mr. Sandbach proceeded firmly. "You didn't see it first. You didn't pick it up. Where do you come in?" "I'm 7 and 6pence out," said Mr. Gale. "And if I give you the coin, which I certainly shall not do, I shall be half a sovereign out." Friendship was again jeopardized when a second interference of fate occurred, in the shape of a young and pretty woman who was coming from the opposite direction, and who astonished both men considerably by stepping in front of them and barring their progress. "Excuse me," said she, in a charming voice, but with a severe air, "but may I ask if you have just picked up that coin?" Mr. Sandbach, after looking vaguely, as if for inspiration, at Mr. Gale, was obliged to admit that he had. "Well," said the young lady, "if it's dated 1898, and if there's an A scratched on it, it's mine. I lost it off my watch chain." Mr. Sandbach examined the coin, and then handed it to her, raising his hat. Mr. Gale also raised his hat. The young lady's grateful smile was enchanting. Both men were bachelors, and invariably ready to be interested. "It was the first money my husband ever earned," the young lady explained with her thanks. The interest of the bachelors evaporated. "Not a profitable afternoon," said Mr. Sandbach, as the train came in and they parted. "I think we ought to share the loss equally," said Mr. Gale. "Do you?" said Mr. Sandbach. "That's like you." End of section 19.
Section 20 of The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Andy Minter. The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories by Arnold, Bennett. Section 20. The Blue Suit. I was just going into my tailor's in Sackville Street, when who should be coming out of the same establishment but Mrs. Ellis. I was startled, as any man might well have been, to see a lady emerging from my tailor's. Of course, a lady might have been to a tailor's to order a tailor-made costume. Such an excursion would be perfectly legal and not at all shocking. But then my tailor does not make for ladies. And moreover, Mrs. Ellis was not what I should call a tailor-made woman. She belonged to the other variety, the fluffy, lacy, flowing variety. I had made her acquaintance on one of my visits to the Five Towns. She was indubitably elegant, but in rather a Midland manner. She was a fine specimen of the provincial woman, and that was one of the reasons why I liked her. Her husband was a successful earthenware manufacturer. Occasionally he had to make long journeys, to Canada, to Australia and New Zealand, in the interests of his business, so that she was sometimes a grass widow with plenty of money to spend. Her age was about 35, bright, agreeable, shrewd, downright, energetic, a little short and a little plump. Wherever she was a centre of interest. In default of children of her own, she amused herself with the children of her husband's sister, Mrs. Carter. Mr. Carter was another successful earthenware manufacturer. Her favourite among nephews and nieces was young Ellis Carter, a considerable local dandy and dog. Such was Mrs. Ellis. "Are you a widow just now?" I asked her, after we had shaken hands. "Yes," she said, "but my husband touched at Port Said yesterday, thank Heaven." "And are you ordering clothes for him to wear on his arrival?" I adopted a teasing tone. "Can you picture Henry in a Sackville Street suit?" She laughed. I could not. Henry's clothes usually had the appearance of being picked up at a Jew's. "Then what are you doing here?" I insisted. "I came because I remembered you saying once that this was your tailor's," she said, "so I thought it would be a pretty good place." Now, I would not class my tailor with the half-dozen great tailors of the world, but all the same he is indeed a pretty good tailor. "That's immensely flattering," I said, "but what have you been doing with him?" "Business," said she. "And if you want to satisfy your extraordinary inquisitiveness any further, don't you think you'd better come right away now and offer me some tea somewhere?" "Splendid," I said. "Where?" "Oh, the Hanover, of course," she answered. "Where's that?" I inquired. "Don't you know the Hanover tea rooms in Regent Street?" she exclaimed, staggered. I have often noticed that metropolitan resorts, which are regarded by provincials as the very latest word of London style, are perfectly unknown to Londoners themselves. She led me along Vigo Street to the Hanover. It was a huge white place with a number of little alcoves and a large band. We installed ourselves in one of the alcoves, with supplies of China tea and multitudinous cakes, and grew piquantly intimate, and then she explained her visit to my tailor's. I propose to give it here as nearly in her own words as I can. 1. "I wouldn't tell you anything about it," she said, "if I didn't know from the way you talk sometimes that you're interested in people. I mean any people, anywhere. Human nature. Everybody that I come across is frightfully interesting to me. Perhaps that's why I've got so many friends. And enemies. I have, you know. I just like watching people to see what they do, and then what they'll do next. I don't seem to mind so much whether they're good or naughty. With me, it's their interestingness that comes first. Now, I suppose you don't know very much about my nephew Ellis Carter. Just met him once, I think, and that's all. Don't you think he's handsome?" "Oh, I do. I think he's very handsome. But then a man and a woman never do agree about what's being handsome in a man. Ellis is only 20, too. He has such nice curly hair, and his eyes. Haven't you noticed his eyes? His father says he's idle, but all fathers say that of their sons. I suppose you'll admit anyhow that he's one of the best dressed youths in the Five Towns. Anybody might think he got his clothes in London, but he doesn't. It seems there's a simply marvellous tailor in Bursley, and Ellis and all his friends go to him. His father is always grumbling at the bills, so his mother told me. Well, when I was at their house in July, there happened to come for Ellis one of those flat boxes that men's tailors always pack suits in, and so I thought I might as well show a great deal of curiosity about it, and I did. And Ellis undid it in the breakfast room, his father wasn't there, and showed me a lovely blue suit. I asked him to go upstairs and put it on. He wouldn't at first, but his sisters and I worried him till he gave way. He came downstairs again like Solomon in all his glory. It really was a lovely suit. No, seriously, I'm not joking. It was a dream. He was very shy in it. I must say men are funny. Even when they really like having new clothes and cutting a figure, they simply hate putting them on for the first time. Ellis is that way. I don't know how many suits that boy hasn't got. Sheer dandyism. And yet he'll keep a new suit in the house a couple of months before wearing it. Now, that's the sort of thing that I call interesting. So curious, isn't it? Ellis wouldn't keep that suit on. No. As soon as we'd done admiring it, he disappeared and changed it. Now, I'd gone that day to ask Ellis to escort me to Llandudno the week after. He likes going about with his auntie, and his auntie likes to have him. And of course she sees that it doesn't cost him anything. But his father has to be placated first. There's another funny thing. His father is always grumbling that Ellis is absolutely no good at all in the works. But the moment there's any question of Ellis going away for a holiday, even if it's only for a weekend, then his father turns right round and wants to make out that Ellis is indispensable. Well, I got over his father. I always do, naturally. And it was settled that Ellis and I should go on the next Saturday. I said to Ellis, "You must be sure to bring that suit with you." And then, will you believe me, he stuck to it. He wouldn't. Truly, I was under the impression that I could argue either Ellis or his father into any mortal thing. But no, I couldn't argue Ellis into agreeing to bring that suit with him to Llandudno. He said he should wear whites. He said it was a September suit. He said that everybody wore blue at Llandudno, and he didn't want to be mistaken for a schoolmaster. Imagine him being mistaken for a schoolmaster. He even said there were some things I didn't understand. I told him there was a very particular reason why I wanted him to take that suit, and there was. He said, "What is the reason?" But I wouldn't tell him that. I wasn't going to knuckle down to him altogether. So it ended that we didn't either of us budge. However, I didn't mean to be beaten by a mere curly-headed boy. I can do what I please with his mother, though she is my eldest sister-in-law. And before he started in the dog-cart to meet me at the station on our way to Llandudno, she gave Ellis a bonnet-box to hand to me, and told him to take great care of it. He handed it over to me, and I also told him to take great care of it. Of course, he became very curious to know what was in it, and I said to him, "You may see it on the pier on Monday. In fact, I believe you will." He said, "It's heavy for a hat." So I informed him that hats were both heavy and large this summer. And he said, "Well, I pity you, auntie." Naturally, it was his blue suit that was in the box. His mother had burgled it after he'd done his packing while he was having lunch. I was determined that he should wear that suit, and I felt pretty sure that when he saw my reason for asking him to bring it, he'd be glad at the bottom of his heart that I'd brought it in spite of him. There's one good thing about Ellis. He can see a joke against himself. Have another cake? Well, I will then. Yes, I'm coming to the reason. 2. A girl, you say? Well, of course. But you mustn't look so proud of yourself. A body needn't be anything like as clever as you are to be able to guess that there's a girl in it. Do you suppose I should have imagined for a moment that it would interest you if there hadn't been a girl in it? Not exactly. Well, it's a girl from Winnipeg. Came to England in June with her parents. Or rather, perhaps her parents came with her. I'd never seen any of the three before. Didn't know them from Adam and Eve. But my husband had made friends with them out there last year. Great friends. And they wanted to make the acquaintance of my husband's wife. I'd gathered from Harry that they were quite my sort. What is my sort? Well, you know perfectly well what my sort is. There are only two sorts of people, the decent sort and the other sort. Well, they were doing England, you know, like colonial people do, seriously, leaving nothing out. By the way, their name was only Smith, without even a Y in it or an E on the end. They wished to try a good seaside place, so I wrote to them and suggested Llandudno as a fair specimen, and spend at least a week together, and afterwards they were to come to the Five Towns. I suggested we should all stay at Hawthornden's. Hawthornden's, don't you know? It's easily the best private hotel in Llandudno. Lift and a French chef and all kinds of things. But surely you must have seen all about it in the papers. That was why I took Ellis with me. I hate travelling about alone, especially when my husband's away. and it was particularly on account of the girl that I stole the blue suit. But I didn't tell Ellis a word about the girl, and I only just mentioned the father and mother, and not even that until we were safely in the train. These young dandies are really very nervous and timid at bottom, you know, in spite of their airs. Ellis would walk 10 miles sooner than have to meet a stranger of the older generation, and he's just as shy about girls too. I believe most men are, if you ask me. The great encounter occurred in the hall just before dinner. They were late, and so were we. I tell you, we were completely outshone. I tell you, we were not in it. Not anywhere near being in it. For one thing, they were in evening dress. Now, at Hawthornden's you never dress for dinner. There isn't a place in Llandudno where it's the exception not to dress for dinner. They seemed rather surprised. Not put out, not ashamed of themselves for being too swagger, but just mildly disappointed with Hawthornden's. The fact is, they didn't think much of Hawthornden's. I learnt all manner of things during dinner. They'd been in Scotland when I corresponded with them, and before that they'd stayed at the Ritz in London, and at the Hotel St. Regis in New York, and there's something else, I forget the name, in Chicago. I was expecting to meet colonials, but it was Ellis and I who were colonial. I could have borne it better if they hadn't been so polite and so anxious to hide their opinion of Hawthornden's. The girl, her name is Nellie. Really very pretty, of only about 18, but as self-possessed as 28. Evidently she'd always been used to treating her parents as equals. She talked quite half the time, and contradicted her mother as flatly as Ellis contradicts me. Mr. Smith didn't talk much, and Ellis didn't at first. He was too timid and awkward, really not at all like himself. However, Miss Nellie soon made him talk, and they got quite friendly and curt with each other. Curious thing, Ellis never notices women's clothes. Very interested in his own and in other men's, but not in women's. So I expect Nellie's didn't make much impression on him. But truly they were stylish. Much too gorgeous for a young girl. Oh, you've no idea. But not vulgar. They'd been bought in London, in Dover Street. Better than mine, and better than her mother's. I will say this for her. She wore them without any self-consciousness, though she came in for a good deal of staring. Heaven knows what they cost. I'd be afraid to guess. But then, you see, the Smiths had come to England to spend money, and, well, they were spending it. All their ideas were larger than ours. When dinner was over, Nellie wanted to know what we could do to amuse ourselves. Well, it was a showery night, and of course there was nothing. Then Ellis said, in his patronizing way, "Suppose we go and knock the balls about a bit." And Nellie said, "Knock the balls about a bit?" "Yes," said Master Ellis, "billiards, you know." All four of us went into the billiard room, and Ellis began to knock the balls about a bit. His father installed a billiard table in his own house a few years ago. The idea was to keep the boy at home. It didn't, of course, not a bit. Ellis is a pretty good player, but he did nearly all his practising at his club. I've often heard his mother regret the £80 odd that billiard table cost. I play a bit, you know. Nellie Smith would not try at first, and Papa Smith was smoking a cigar, and he said he couldn't do justice to a cigar and a cue at the same time. So Ellis and I had a 25 up. He gave me 10, and I beat him, probably because he would keep on smoking cigarettes, just to show Papa Smith how well he could keep the smoke out of his eyes. Then he asked Nellie if she'd try. She said she would, if her pa would, and she and her pa put themselves against Ellis and me. Well, I'll cut it short. That girl, with her pink and white complexion, she began right off with a break of 28. You should have seen Ellis's face. It was the funniest thing I ever saw in my life. I can't remember anything that ever struck me as half so funny. It seems that they have plenty of time for billiards out in Winnipeg, and have a very high-class table. After a while, Ellis saw the funniness of it too. He made a miss, and then he said, "Will somebody kindly take me out and bury me?" That kind of speech is supposed to be very smart at his club, and the Smiths thought it was smart too. Nellie and her pa beat us hollow, and then Nellie began to take her pa to task for showing off too much, with too much screw, instead of using the natural angle. Ellis went to bed. He was very struck by Nellie's talents, but he went to bed. Probably he wanted to think things over and consider how he could be impressive with her. I should have liked to have broken it to him about his blue suit, because it was Sunday the next day, and Nellie was bound to be gorgeous for chapel and pier, and I felt sure he'd be really glad to have that suit, whatever he might say to me. And I wanted him to wear it too, but there was no chance for me to tell him. He went off to bed like a streak of lightning, and usually, you know, he simply will not go to bed. Nothing will induce him to go to bed, just as nothing will induce him to get up. I said to myself that I would send the suit into his room early in the morning with a note. I did want him to look his best. Then, of course, there was the fire. The fire was that very night. What? 3. Do you actually mean to sit there and tell me you never heard about the fire at Hawthornden's Hotel last July? Why, it was the sensation of the season. There was over a column about it in the Manchester Guardian. Everyone talked about it for weeks. And no one ever told you that we were in it. Half the annex was burnt down. We were in the annex, all 4 of us. I fancy the Smiths had chosen it because the rooms in the annex are larger. Have you ever been in a fire? Well, thank your stars. We were wakened up at 3 o'clock. It was getting light even. Somehow that made it worse. The confusion, you can't imagine it. We got out all right. Oh, there was no special danger to life and limb. But after all, we only did just get out in time. And with practically nothing but our dressing gowns. Some not even that. It's queer in a fire how at first you try to save things and keep calm and pretend you are calm until the thing gets hold of you. I actually began to shovel clothes into my trunks. Somebody said we should have time for that. Well, we hadn't, and it was a very good thing there wasn't a lift in the annex. It seems a lift, well, acts like a chimney, and half of us might have been burnt alive. I must say the fire brigade was pretty good. They got the fire out very well, very quickly, in fact. We women, or most of us, had been bundled into private parlours and things in the main part of the hotel, which wasn't threatened, and when we knew that the fire was out, we naturally wanted to go back and see whether any of our things could be saved out of the wreck. Oh, what a sight it was! What a sight it was! You'd never believe that so much damage could be done in an hour or so, chiefly by water, of course. All the ground floor was swimming in water. In fact, there was a river of it running across the promenade into the sea. About 5/6 of Llandudno, dressed nohow, was on the promenade. However, policemen kept the people outside the gates. The firemen began bringing trunks down the stairs. They wouldn't let us go up at first. It really was a wonderful scene at the foot of the stairs. Lots of us paddling about in that lake, and perfectly lost to all sense of, what shall I say, well, correctness. I do believe most of us had forgotten all about civilization. We wanted our things. We wanted our things so badly that we even lost our interest in the origin of the fire, and in the question whether we should get anything out of the insurance company. By the way, I mustn't omit to tell you that we never saw the proprietors after the fire was out. The proprietors could only be seen by appointment. The German and Swiss waiters had to bear the brunt of us. I was very lucky. I received both my trunks nearly at once. They came sliding on a plank down those stairs, and most of my things were in them, too. I was determined to be energetic then, and get out of all that crowd. Do you know what I did? I simply called 2 men in out of the street and told them to shoulder my trunks into the main building of the hotel. I defied policemen and the superintendent of the fire brigade, and in the main building I demanded a bedroom, and I was told that everything would be done to accommodate me as quickly as possible. So I went straight upstairs and told the men to follow me, and I began knocking at every door till I found a room that wasn't occupied, and I took possession of it and gave the men a shilling apiece. They seemed to expect half a crown, because I'd been in a fire, I suppose. Curious ideas odd job men have. Then I dressed myself out of what was left of my belongings and went down again. All the people said how lucky I was, and what presence of mind I had, and how calm and practical I was, and so on and so on. But they didn't know that I'd been stupid enough not to give a thought to Ellis's blue suit. One can't think of everything, and I didn't think of that. I believe if I had thought of it at the start I should have taken the bonnet box with me at any cost. I came across Ellis smoking a cigarette, of course, just to show, I suppose, that a fire was the most ordinary event to him. He was completely dressed like me. He had saved the whole of his belongings. He said the Smiths were fixing themselves up in private rooms somewhere and would be down soon. So we moved along into the dining room and had breakfast. The place was full and noisy. Ellis was exceedingly facetious. He said, "Well, Auntie, did you have a pretty good night?" Also, "A fire is a very clumsy way of waking you up in the morning. A bell would have been much simpler and cost less, etc., etc." And then he said, "A nice thing, Auntie, if I'd followed your advice and brought my beauteous new suit. It would have been bound to be burnt to a cinder. One's best suit always is in a fire." I ought to have told him then the trick I'd played on him, but I didn't. I merely agreed with him in a lame sort of way that it would have been a nice thing if he'd brought his beauteous suit. I hoped that I might be able later on to invent some good excuse, something really plausible, for having brought along with me his newest suit unknown to him. But the more I reflected, the more I couldn't think of anything clever enough. Then the three Smiths came in. There was some queer attire in that dining room, but I think that Mrs. Smith won the gold medal for queerness. All her colonialness had come out suddenly. They evidently hadn't been very fortunate. But they didn't seem to mind much. They hadn't thought very highly of the hotel before, and they accepted the fire good-humouredly as one of the necessary drawbacks of a hotel that wasn't quite up to their Winnipeg form. Nellie Smith was delightful, I must say. She was delightful. And she looked delightful. She was wearing a blue and red striped petticoat, rather short, and a white jersey, and over that a man's blue jacket, which fitted her pretty well. She looked indescribably pert and charming, though the jacket was dirty and stained. I noticed Ellis staring and staring at that jacket. I needn't tell you. You can see a mile off what happened. Ellis said, in his casual way, "Hello, where did you pick up that affair, Miss Smith?" meaning the jacket. She said she'd picked it up on one of the landings, and there was a pair of continuations lying in a broken bonnet box just close to it, and that the continuations were ruined by too much water. I could feel myself blushing redder and redder. "In a bonnet box, eh?" said Master Ellis. Then he said, "Would you mind letting me look at the right-hand breast pocket of that jacket?" She didn't mind in the least. He looked at the strip of white linen that your men's tailors always stitch into that pocket with your name and address and date and age and weight and I don't know what. He said, "Thank you." And she asked him if the jacket was his. "Yes," he said, "but I hope you'll keep it." Everybody said what a very curious coincidence. Ellis avoided my eyes, and I avoided his. Will you believe me that when we had it out afterwards, he and I, that boy was seriously angry. He suspected me of a plan to make the best of him during the stay with the Smiths, and he very strongly objected to being made the best of. His notion, apparently, was that even his worst was entirely good enough for my colonial friends. Although, as he'd have said, they simply had wiped the floor with him in the billiard-room. Anyhow, he was furious. He actually used the word unwarrantable, and it was rather a long word for a mere stripling of a nephew to use to an auntie who was paying all his expenses. However, he's a nice enough boy at the bottom, and soon got down off his high horse. I must tell you that Nellie Smith wore that jacket all day, quite without any concern. Those colonials really don't seem to mind what they wear. At any rate, she didn't. She was just as much at ease in that jacket as she had been in her gorgeousness the evening before. And she and Ellis were walking about together all day. The next day, of course, we all left. We couldn't stay, seeing the state we were in. Now, don't you think it's a very curious story?" Thus spake Mrs. Ellis across the tea-table in an alcove at the Hanover. "But you've not finished the story," I explained. "Yes, I have," she said. "You haven't explained what you were doing at my tailor's in Sackville Street." "Oh!" she cried, "I was forgetting that. Well, I promised Ellis a new suit, and as I wanted to show him that, after all, I had larger ideas about tailoring than he had, I told him that I knew a very good tailor's in Sackville Street, a real West End tailor, and that if he liked he could have his presentation suit made there. He pooh-poohed the offer at first, and pretended that his Bursley tailor was just as good as any of your West End tailors, but at last he accepted. You see, it meant an authorized visit to London. I'd been into the tailor's just now to pay the bill, that's all. "But even now," I said, "you haven't finished the story." "Yes, I have," she replied again. "What about Nellie Smith?" I demanded. "A story about a handsome girl named Nellie who could make a break of 28 at billiards, and a handsome dog like Ellis Carter, and a fire, and the girl wearing the youth's jacket. It can't break off like that." "Look here," she said, leaning a little across the table. "Did you expect them to fall in love with one another on the spot and be engaged? What a sentimental old thing you are after all! But haven't they seen each other since?" "Oh yes, in London, and in Bursley too." "And haven't they?" "Not yet. They may or they mayn't. You must remember that this isn't the reign of Queen Victoria. If they do, I'll let you know." End of section 20. Section 21 of The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Andy Minter. The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories by Arnold, Bennett. Section 21. The Tiger and the Baby. 1. George Peel and Mary, his wife, sat down to breakfast. Their only son, Georgie, was already seated. George the younger showed an astounding disregard for the decencies of life, and a frankly gluttonous absorption in food, which amounted to cynicism. Evidently he cared for nothing but the satisfaction of bodily desires. Yet he was 22 months old, and occupied a commanding situation in a high chair. His father and mother were aged 32 and 28 respectively. They both had pale, intellectual faces. They were dressed with elegance, and their gestures were the gestures of people accustomed to be waited upon, and to consider luxuries as necessities. There was silver upon the table, and the room, though small and somewhat disordered, had in it beautiful things, which had cost money. Through a doorway, half screened by a portière, could be seen a large studio, peopled with heroic statuary, plaster casts, and lumps of clay veiled in wet cloths. And on the other side of the great window of the studio, green trees waved their foliage. The trees were in Regent's Park. Another detail to show that the Peels had not precisely failed in life: the time was then 10:30 o'clock. Millions of persons in London had already been at hard work for hours. And indeed George Peel was not merely a young sculptor of marked talent, he was also a rising young sculptor. For instance, when you mentioned his name in artistic circles, the company signified that it knew whom you meant, and those members of the company who had never seen his work had to feel ashamed of themselves. Further, he had lately been awarded the triennial gold medal of the International Society, an honour that no Englishman had previously achieved. His friends and himself, by the way, celebrated this dazzling event by a noble and joyous gathering in the studio, at which famous personages had been present. Everybody knew that George Peel, in addition to what he earned, had important private resources, for even rising young sculptors cannot live luxuriously on what they gain, and you cannot eat gold medals. Nor will gold medals pay a heavy rent or the cost of manual help in marble cutting. All other rising young sculptors envied George Peel, and he rather condescended to them, in his own mind, because they had to keep up appearances by means of subterfuges, whereas there was no deception about his large and ample existence. On the table by Mary's plate was a letter, the sole letter. It had come by the second post. The contents of the first post had been perused in bed. While Mary was scraping porridge off the younger George's bib with a spoon, and wiping porridge out of his eyes with a serviette, George the elder gave just a glance at the letter. "So he's written after all," said George, in a voice that tried to be nonchalant. "Who?"
asked Mary, although she had already seen the envelope and knew exactly what George meant, and her voice also was unnatural in its attempted casualness. "The old cock," said George, beginning to serve bacon. "Oh!" said Mary, coming to her chair and beginning to dispense tea. She was dying to open the letter, yet she poured out the tea with superhuman leisureliness, and then indicated to Georgie exactly where to search for bits of porridge on his big plate, while George, with great appearance of calm, unfolded a newspaper. Then at length she did open the letter. Having read it, she put her lips tighter together, nodded, and passed the letter to George. And George read: "Dear Mary, I cannot accede to your request. Your affectionate uncle, Samuel Peel. P.S. The expenses connected with my county council election will be terrible. S.P." George lifted his eyebrows as if to indicate that in his opinion there was no accounting for the wild stupidity of human nature, and that he, as a philosopher, refused to be startled by anything whatever. "Curt!" he muttered coldly. Mary uneasily laughed. "What shall you do?" she inquired. "Without," replied George, with a curtness that equalled Mary's uncle's. "And what about the rent?" "The rent will have to wait." A brave young man! Nevertheless, he saw in that moment chasms at his feet, chasms which he and his wife and child and his brilliant prospects might be swallowed up. He changed the subject. "You didn't see this cutting?" he said, and passed a slip from a newspaper gummed to a piece of green paper. George, in his quality of rising young sculptor, received press cuttings from an agency. This one was from a somewhat vulgar society journal, and it gave, in 2 paragraphs, an account of the recent festivity at George's studio. It finished with the words, "Heidsieck flowed freely." He could not guess who had written it. No, it was not in the nicest taste, but it furnished indubitable proof that George was still rising, that he was a figure in the world. "What a rag!" he observed, with an explosion of repugnance. "Read by suburban shop girls, I suppose." II George had arranged his career in a quite exceptional way. It is true that chance had served him, but then he had known how to make use of chance to the highest advantage. The chance that had served him lay in the fact that Mary Peel had fallen gravely in love with him, that her sole surviving relative was a rich uncle, and that George's surname was the same as hers and her uncle's. He had met niece and uncle in Bursley in the Five Towns, where old Samuel Peel was a personage and, timidly, a patron of the arts. Having regard to his golden hair and affection compelling appearance, it was not surprising that Mary, accustomed to the monotony of her uncle's house, had surrendered her heart to him. And it was not surprising that old Peel had at once consented to the match, and made a will in favour of Mary and her offspring. What was surprising was that old Peel should have begun to part with his money at once and in large quantities, for he was not of a very open-handed disposition. The explanation of old Samuel Peel's generosity was due to his being a cousin of the Peels of Bursley, the great 18th century family of earthenware manufacturers. The main branch had died out, the notorious Carlotta Peel having expired shockingly in Paris, and another young descendant, Matthew, having been forced under a will to alter his name to Peel Swynnerton, so that only the distant cousin, Samuel Peel, was left, and he was a bachelor with no prospect of ever being anything else. Now Samuel had made a fortune of his own, and he considered that all the honour and all the historical splendours of the Peel family were concentrated in himself, and he tried to be worthy of them. He tried to restore the family traditions. For this he became a benefactor to his native town, a patron of the arts, and a candidate for the Staffordshire County Council. And when Mary set her young mind on a young man of parts and of ambition, and bearing by hazard the very same name of Peel, old Samuel Peel said to himself, "The old family name will not die out. It ought to be more magnificent than ever. He said this also to George Peel. Whereupon George Peel talked to him persuasively and sensibly about the risks and prizes of the sculptor's career. He explained just how extremely ambitious he was, and all that he had already done, and all that he intended to do. And he convinced his father-in-law that young sculptors were tremendously handicapped in an expensive and difficult profession by poverty, or at least narrowness of means. He convinced his uncle-in-law that the best manner of succeeding was to begin at the top, to try for only the highest things, to sell nothing cheaply, to be haughty with dealers and connoisseurs, and to cut a figure in the very centre of the art world of London. George was a good talker, and all that he said was perfectly true, and his uncle was dazzled by the immediate prospect of new fame for the ancient family of Peel. And in the end old Samuel promised to give George and Mary 500 a year, so that George, as a sculptor, might begin at the top and succeed like success. And George went off with his bride to London, whence he had come, and the old man thought he had done a very noble and very wonderful thing, which, indeed, he had. This had occurred when George was 25. Matters fell out rather as George had predicted. The youth almost at once obtained a commission for £300 worth of symbolic statues for the front of the central offices of the Order of Rechabites, which particularly pleased his uncle, because Samuel Peel was a strong temperance man, and George got one or two other commissions. Being extravagant was to George Peel the same thing as putting all the profits into the business is to a manufacturer. He was extravagant and ostentatious on principle, and by far-sighted policy. Or at least he thought he was. And thus the world's rumours multiplied his success, and many persons said and believed that he was making quite 2,000 a year, and would be an ARA before he was grey-haired. But George always related the true facts to his uncle-in-law. He even made them out to be much less satisfactory than they really were. His favourite phrase in letters to his uncle was that he was building, not houses, but his future reputation and success. Then commissions fell off, or grew intermittent, or were refused as being unworthy of George's dignity. And then young Georgie arrived with his insatiable appetites and his vociferous need of doctors, nurses, perambulators, nurseries, and lacy garments. And all the time young George's father kept his head high and continued to be extravagant by far-sighted policy. And the 500 a year kept coming in regularly by quarterly instalments. Many a tight morning George nearly decided that Mary must write to her uncle and ask for a little supplementary estimate. But he never did decide, partly because he was afraid, and partly from sheer pride. According to his original statements to his uncle-in-law 7 years earlier, he ought, at this epoch, to have been in an assured position with a genuine income of thousands. But the state of trade worsened, and he had a cheque dishonoured. And then he won the triennial gold medal. And then, at length, he did arrange with Mary that she should write to old Samuel and roundly ask him for an extra couple of hundred. They composed the letter together, and they stated the reasons so well, and convinced themselves so completely of the rightness of their cause, that for a few moments they looked on the 200 as already in hand. Hence the Heidsieck night. But on the morrow of the Heidsieck night they thought differently, and George was gloomy. He felt humiliated by the necessity of the application to his uncle, the first he had ever made, and he feared the result. His fears were justified. 3. They were far more than justified. 3 mornings after the first letter, to which she had made no reply, Mary received a second. It ran: "Dear Mary, and what is more, I shall henceforth pay you 300 instead of 500 a year. If George has not made a position for himself, it is quite time he had. The gold medal must make a lot of difference to him, and if necessary you must economize. I'm sure there is room for economy in your household. Champagne, for instance. Your affectionate uncle, Samuel Peel." P.S. I am, of course, acting in your best interests. S.P. This letter infuriated George, so much that George the younger, observing strange symptoms on his father's face, and strange sounds issuing from his father's mouth, stopped eating in order to give the whole of his attention to them. "Champagne? What is he driving at?" exclaimed George, glaring at Mary as though it was Mary who had written the letter. "I expect he's been reading that paper," said Mary. "Do you mean to say," George asked scornfully, "that your uncle reads a rag like that? I thought all his lot looked down on worldliness." "So they do," said Mary. "But somehow they like reading about it. I believe uncle has read it every week for 20 years." "Well, why didn't you tell me?" "The other morning?" "Yes." "Oh, I didn't want to worry you. What good would it have done?" "What good would it have done?" George repeated in accents of terrible disdain, as though the good that it would have done was obvious to the lowest intelligence. Yet he knew quite well that it would have done no good at all. "Georgie, take that spoon out of your sleeve." And Georgie, usually disobedient, took the porridge-laden spoon out of his sleeve and glanced at his mother for moral protection. His mother merely wiped him rather roughly. Georgie thought once more that he would never in the world understand grown-up people, and the recurring thought made him cry gently. George lapsed into savage meditation. During all the 7 years of his married life he had somehow supposed himself to be superior, as a man, to his struggling rivals. He had regarded them with easy toleration, as from a height. And now he saw himself tumbling down among them, humiliated. Everything seemed unreal to him then. The studio and the breakfast-room were solid. The waving trees in Regent's Park were solid. The rich knick-knacks and beautiful furniture and excellent food and fine clothes were all solid enough. But they seemed most disconcertingly unreal. One letter from old Samuel had made them tremble, and the second had reduced them to illusions or delusions. Even George's reputation as a rising sculptor appeared utterly fallacious. What rendered him savage was the awful injustice of Samuel. Samuel had no right whatever to play him such a trick. It was, in a way, worse than if Samuel had cut off the allowance altogether. For in that case he could at any rate have gone majestically to Samuel and said, "Your niece and her child are starving." But with a minimum of 300 a year for their support, 3 people cannot possibly starve. "Ring the bell and have this kid taken out," said he. Whereupon Georgie yelled. Kate came, a starched white and blue young thing of 16. "Kate," said George autocratically, "take baby." "Yes, sir," said Kate, with respectful obedience. The girl had no notion that she was not real to her master, or that her master was saying to himself, "I ought not to be ordering human beings about like this. I can't pay their wages. I ought to be starving in a garret." When George and Mary were alone, George said, "Look here, does he mean it?" "You may depend he means it. It's so like him. Me asking for that £200 must have upset him. And then seeing that about Heidsieck in the paper. He'd make up his mind all of a sudden. I know him so well." "H'm," snorted George. "I shall make my mind up all of a sudden too." "What shall you do?" "There's one thing I shan't do," said George, "and that is stop here. Do you realise, my girl, that we shall be absolutely up a gum tree?" "I should have thought you would be able." "Absolute gum tree," George interrupted her. "Simply can't keep the shop open. To morrow, my child, we go down to Bursley." "Who?" "You, me, and the infant." "And what about the servants?" "Send them home." "But we can't descend on uncle like that, without notice, and him full of his election. Besides, he's cross." "We shan't descend on him." "Then where shall you go?" "We shall put up at the Tiger," said George impressively. "The Tiger?" gasped Mary. George had meant to stagger, and he had staggered. The Tiger," he iterated.
"With Georgie?"
"With Georgie."
"But what will uncle say? I shouldn't be surprised if uncle has never been in the Tiger in his life. You know his views."
"I don't care twopence for your uncle," said George, again implicitly blaming Mary for the peculiarities of her uncle's character. "Something's got to be done, and I'm going to do it." IV 2 days later, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, Samuel Peel, J.P., entered the market place, Bursley, from the top of Oldcastle Street. He had walked down, as usual, from his dignified residence at Hillport. It was his day for the bench, and he had, moreover, a lot of complicated election business. On a dozen hoardings between Hillport and Bursley Market Place blazed the red letters of his posters, inviting the faithful to vote for Peel, whose family had been identified with the district for a century and a half. He was pleased with these posters, and with the progress of canvassing. A slight and not a tall man, with a feeble grey beard and a bald head, he was yet a highly respected figure in the town. He had imposed himself upon the town by regular habits, strict morals, a reasonable philanthropy, and a successful career. He had, despite natural disadvantages, upheld on high the great name of Peel, so that he entered the town on that fine morning with a certain conquering jauntiness, and citizens saluted him with respect, and he responded with benignity. And as, nearly opposite that celebrated hotel, the Tiger, he was about to cross over to the eastern porch of the town hall, he saw a golden-haired man approaching him with a perambulator. And the sight made him pause involuntarily. It was a strange sight. Then he recognized his nephew-in-law, and he blanched, partly from excessive astonishment, but partly from fear. "How do, uncle?" said George nonchalantly, as though he had parted from him the previous evening. "Just hang on to this pram a sec, will you?" And pushing the perambulator towards Samuel Peel, J.P., George swiftly fled, and for the perfection of his uncle-in-law's amazement, disappeared into the Tiger. Then the occupant of the perambulator began to weep. The figure of Samuel Peel, dressed as a Justice of the Peace should be dressed for the bench, in a frock coat and a ceremonious necktie, and, of course, spats over his spotless boots, the figure of Samuel Peel, the wrinkled and dry bachelor, who never in his life had held a saucepan of infant's food over a gas jet in the middle of the night, this figure, staring horror-struck through spectacles at the loud contents of the perambulator, soon excited attention in the market-place of Bursley. And Mr. Peel perceived the attention. He guessed that the babe was Mary's babe, though he was quite incapable of recognizing it. And he could not imagine what George was doing with it and the perambulator in Bursley, nor why he had vanished so swiftly into the Tiger, nor why he had not come out again. The whole situation was in the acutest degree mysterious. It was also in the acutest degree amazing. Samuel Peel had no facility in baby talk, so, to tranquillize Georgie, he attempted soothing strokes or pats on such portions of Georgie's skin as were exposed. Whereupon Georgie shrieked, and even dogs stood still and lifted noses inquiringly. Then Jos Curtenty, very ancient but still a wag, passed by and said, "Hello, Mr. Peel. Truth well out. And who'd have suspected you of being secretly married?" Samuel Peel could not take offence, because Jos Curtenty, besides being old and an alderman and an ex-mayor, was an important member of his election committee. Of course, such a friendly joke from an incurable joker like Jos Curtenty was all right. But supposing enemies began to joke on similar lines, how he might be prejudiced at the polls! It was absurd, totally absurd, to conceive Samuel Peel in any other relation than that of an uncle to a baby. Yet the more absurd a slander, the more likely it is to be believed. And a slander, once started, could never be overtaken. What on earth was George Peel doing in Bursley with that baby? Why had he not announced his arrival? Where was the baby's mother? Where was their luggage? Why, in the name of reason, had George vanished so swiftly into the Tiger? And what, in the name of decency and sobriety, was he doing in the Tiger for such a prodigious time?
It occurred to him that possibly George had written to him and the letter had miscarried. But in that case, where had they slept the previous night? They couldn't have come down from London that morning. It was too early. Little George persevered in the production of yells that might have been heard as far as the Wesleyan Chapel, and certainly as far as the Conservative Club. Then Mr Duncalf, the town clerk, went by from his private office towards the town hall, and saw the singular spectacle of the public man and the perambulator. Mr Duncalf, too, was a bachelor. "So you've come down to see 'em?" said Mr Duncalf gruffly, pretending that the baby was not there. "Say whom?" "Well, your niece and husband, of course." "Where are they?" asked Mr Peel, without having sufficiently considered the consequences of his question. "Aren't they in the Tiger?" said Mr Duncalf. "They put up there yesterday afternoon, anyhow. But naturally you know that." He departed, nodding. The baby's extraordinary noise incommoded him, and seemed somehow to make him blush if he stood near it. Mr Peel did not gasp. It is at least 2 centuries since men gasped from astonishment. Nevertheless, Mr Duncalf, with those careless words, had simply knocked the breath out of him. Never, never could he have guessed, even in the wildest surmise, that Mary and her husband and child would sleep at the Tiger. The thought unmanned him. What? A baby at the Tiger? Let it not be imagined for a moment that the Tiger is not an utterly respectable hotel. It is, always was, always will be. Not the faintest slur had ever been cast on its licence. Still, it had a bar and a barmaid, and indubitably people drank at the bar. When a prominent man took to drink, as prominent men sometimes did, people would say, "He's always nipping into the Tiger," or "You'll see him at the Tiger before 11 o'clock in the morning." Hence, to Samuel Peel, total abstainer and temperance reformer, the Tiger, despite its vast respectability and the reputation of its 18-penny ordinary, was a place of sin, a place of contamination, briefly, a gin palace, if not a gaming saloon. On principle, Samuel Peel, as his niece suspected, had never set foot in the Tiger. The thought that his great nephew and his niece had actually slept there horrified him. And further and worse, what would people say about Samuel Peel's relatives having to stop at the Tiger, while Samuel Peel's large house up at Hillport was practically empty? Would they not deduce family quarrels, feuds, scandals? The situation was appalling. He glanced about, but he did not look high enough to see that George was watching him from a second-floor window of the Tiger, and he could not hear Mary imploring George, "Oh, for goodness' sake, go back to him." Ladies passed along the pavement, stifling their curiosity. At the back of the town hall there began to collect the usual crowd of idlers who interest themselves in the sittings of the police court. Then Georgie, bored with weeping, dropped off into slumber. Samuel Peel saw that he could not with dignity lift the perambulator up the steps into the porch of the Tiger, and so he began to wheel it cautiously down the side entrance into the Tiger yard. And in the yard he met George, just emerging from the side door, on whose lamp is written the word "Billiards." "So sorry to have troubled you, uncle, but the wife's unwell, and I'd forgotten something. Asleep, is he?" George spoke in a matter-of-fact tone, with no hint whatever that he bore ill will against Samuel Peel for having robbed him of 200 a year, and Samuel felt as though he had robbed George of 200 a year. "But," asked Samuel, what are you doing here?" "We're stopping here," said George. "I've come down to look out for some work, modelling or anything I can get hold of. I shall begin a round of the manufacturers this afternoon. We shall stay here till I can find furnished rooms or a cheap house. It's all up with sculpture now, you know." "Why, I thought you were doing excellently. That medal—" "Yes, in reputation. But it was just now that I wanted money for a big job. And, well, I couldn't have it. So here you are, 7 years wasted. But, of course, it was better to cut the loss. I never pretend that things aren't what they are. Mind you, I'm not blaming you, uncle. You're no doubt hard up like other people." But," Samuel began, stammering again. "Why on earth didn't you come straight to me instead of here?" George put on a confidential look. "The fact is," he said, "Mary wouldn't. She's vexed. You know how women are. They never understand things, especially money." "Vexed with me?" "Yes." "But why?" Again Samuel felt like a culprit. "I fancy it must have been something you said in your letter concerning champagne." "Yes, it was only what I read about you in the paper." "I suppose so. But she thinks you meant it to insult her. She thinks you must have known perfectly well that we simply asked the reporter to put champagne in because it looks well. Seems very flourishing, you know." "I must see Mary," said Samuel. "Of course the idea of you staying on here is perfectly ridiculous. Perfectly ridiculous. Why do you suppose people will say?" "I'd like you to see her," said George. "I wish you would. You may be able to do what I can't. You'll find her in room 14. She's all dressed. But I warn you she's in a fine state." "You'd better come too," said Samuel. George lifted Georgie out of the perambulator. "Here," said George. "Supposing you carry him to her." Samuel hesitated and yielded, and the strange procession started upstairs. In 2 hours a cab was taking all the Peels to Hillport. In 2 days George and his family were returning to London, sure of the continuance of £500 a year, and with a gift of £200 supplementary cash. But it was long before Bursley ceased to talk of George Peel and his family putting up at the Tiger, and it was still longer before the barmaid ceased to describe to her favourite customers the incredible spectacle of Samuel Peel, J.P., stumbling up the stairs of the Tiger with an infant in his arms. End of section 21.
Section 22 of The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Andy Minter. The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories by Arnold, Bennett. Section 22. The Revolver. When friends observed his occasional limp, Alderman Keats would say, with an air of false casualness, "Oh, a touch of the gout." And after a year or two, the limp having increased in frequency and become almost lameness, he would say, "My gout." He also acquired the use of the word twinge. A scowl of torture would pass across his face, and then he would murmur, "Twinge." He was proud of having the gout, the rich man's disease. Alderman Keats had begun life in Hanbridge as a grocer's assistant. A very simple person indeed. At 48 he was wealthy and an alderman. It is something to be an alderman of a town of 60,000 inhabitants. It was at the age of 45 that he had first consulted his doctor as to certain capricious pains, which the doctor had diagnosed as gout. The diagnosis had enchanted him, though he tried to hide his pleasure, pretending to be angry and depressed. It seemed to Alderman Keats a mark of distinction to be afflicted with the gout. Quite against the doctor's orders, he purchased a stock of port, and began to drink it steadily. He was determined that there should be no mistake about his gout. He was determined to have the gout properly and fully. Indulgence in port made him somewhat rubicund and portly, he who had once been a pale little counter-jumper, and by means of shooting coats, tight gaiters, and the right shape of hat, he turned himself into a passable imitation of the fine old English gentleman. His tone altered too, and instead of being uniformly diplomatic, it varied abruptly between a sort of cheerable philanthropy and a sort of Wellingtonian ferocity. During an attack of gout he was terrible in the house, and the oaths that he rapped out in the drawing-room could be heard in the kitchen and further. Nobody minded, however, for everyone shared in the glory of his gout, and cheerfully understood that a furious temper was inseparable from gout. Alderman Keats succeeded once in being genuinely laid up with the gout. He then invited acquaintances to come and solace him in misfortune,
and his acquaintances discovered him with one swathed leg horizontal on a chair in front of his armchair, and twinging and swearing like anything, in the very manner of an 18th century squire. And even in that plight he would insist on a glass of port to cheat the doctor. He had two boys, aged 16 and 12, and he would allow both of them to drink wine in the evening, saying they must learn to carry their liquor like gentlemen. When the lad of 12 calmly ordered the new parlour maid to bring him the maraschino, Alderman Keats thought that was a great joke. Quickly he developed into the acknowledged champion of all ancient English characteristics, customs, prejudices, and ideals. It was this habit of mind that led to the revolver. He saw the revolver prominent in the window of Stretton's, the pawnbroker in Crown Square, and the notion suddenly occurred to him that a fine old English gentleman could not be considered complete without a revolver. He bought the weapon, which Stetson guaranteed to be first-rate and fatal, and which was, in fact, pretty good. It seemed to the alderman bright, complex, and heavy. He had imagined a revolver to be smaller and lighter, but then he had never handled an instrument more dangerous than a razor. He hesitated about going to his cousin's, Joe Keats, the ironmonger. Joe Keats always laughed at him as if he were a farce. Joe would not be ceremonious, and could not be corrected because he was a relative and of equal age with the alderman. But he was obliged to go to Joe Keats, as Joe made a speciality of cartridges. In Hanbridge, people who wanted cartridges went, as a matter of course, to Joe's. So Alderman Keats strolled with grand casualness into Joe's, and said, "I say, Joe, I want some cartridges." "What for?" the thin Joe asked. "A barker," the alderman replied, pleased with this word, and producing the revolver. "Oh, well," said Joe, "you don't mean to say you're going about with that thing in your pocket, do you?" "Why not?" "No reason why not. But you ought to be preceded by a chap with a red flag, you know, same as a steam roller." And the alderman, ignoring this, remarked with court haughtiness, "Every man ought to have a revolver." Then he went to his tailor and had a right-hand hip pocket put into all his breeches. Soon afterwards, walking down Slippery Lane, near the Big Pits, notorious a haunt of mischief, he had an encounter with a collier who was drunk enough to be insulting and sober enough to be dangerous. In relating the affair afterwards, Alderman Keats said, "Fortunately I had my revolver, and I soon whipped it out, I can tell you." "And are you really never without your revolver?" he was asked. "Never." "And it's always loaded?" "Always. What's the good of a revolver that isn't loaded?" Thus he became known as the man who never went out without a loaded revolver in his pocket. The revolver indubitably impressed people. It seemed to match the gout. People grew to understand that evil doers had better look out for themselves if they meant to disturb Alderman Keats with his gout and his revolver all ready to be whipped out. One day Brindley, the architect from Bursley, who knew more about music than revolvers, called to advise the alderman concerning some projected alterations to his stabling, alterations not necessitated by the purchase of a motor car, for motor cars were not Old English. And somehow, while they were in the stable yard, the revolver got into the conversation, and Brindley said, "I should like to see you hit something. You'll scarcely believe me, but I've never seen a revolver fired. Not with shot in it, I mean." Alderman Keats smiled bluffly. "I've been told it's difficult enough to hit even a door with a revolver," said Brindley. "Now, you see that keyhole?" said the alderman, startlingly, pointing to a worn, rusty keyhole in the middle of the vast double doors of the carriage house. Brindley admitted that he did see it. The next moment there was an explosion, and the alderman glanced at the smoking revolver, blew on it suspiciously, and put it back into his celebrated hip pocket. Brindley, whom the explosion had intimidated, examined the double doors and found no mark. "Where did you hit?" he inquired. "Through the keyhole," said the alderman after a pause. He opened the doors and showed half a load of straw in the dusk behind them. "The bullet's embedded in there," said he. "Well," said Brindley, "that's not so bad, that isn't." "There aren't 5 men in the Five Towns who could do that," the alderman said. And as he said it he looked, with his legs spread apart and his short-tailed coat and his general bluff sturdiness, almost as Old English as he would have desired to look, except that his face had paled somewhat. Mr. Brindley thought that the transient pallor had been caused by legitimate pride in high-class revolver shooting, but he was wrong. It had been caused by simple fear. The facts of the matter were that Alderman Keats had never before dared to fire the revolver, and that the infernal noise and the jar on his hand, which had held the weapon too loosely, had given him what is known in the Five Towns as a fearful start. He had offered to shoot on the spur of the moment, without due reflection, and he had fired as a woman might have fired. It was a piece of the most heavenly good fortune that he had put the bullet through the keyhole. Indeed, at first he was inclined to believe that marksmanship must be less difficult than it was reported to be, for his aim had been entirely casual. In saying to Brindley, "You see that keyhole?" he had merely been boasting in a jocular style. However, when Brindley left, Brindley carried with him the alderman's reputation as a perfect Wild West shot. The alderman had it in mind to practise revolver shooting seriously, until the Keats coachman made a discovery later in the day. The coachman slept over the carriage house, and on going up the ladder to put on his celluloid collar, he perceived a hole in his ceiling and some plaster on his bit of carpet. The window had been open all day. The alderman had not only failed to get the keyhole, he had not only failed to get the double doors, he had failed to hit any part whatsoever of the ground floor. And this unsettled the alderman. This proved to the alderman that the active use of a revolver incurred serious perils. It proved to him that nearly anything might happen with a revolver. He might aim at a lamp post and hit the town hall clock. He might mark down a burglar and destroy the wife of his affections. There were no limits to what could occur. And so he resolved never to shoot any more. He would still carry the revolver, but for his Old English gentlemanliness he would rely less on that than on the gout. But the whole town, by which I mean the councillors and the leading manufacturers and tradesmen and their sons, had now an interest in the revolver. For Brindley, the architect, had spoken of that which he had seen before his own eyes. Some people accepted the alderman without demur as a great and terrible shot, but others talked about a fluke, and a very small minority mentioned that there was such a thing as a blank cartridge. It was the monstrous slander of this minority that induced the alderman to stand up morally for his revolver, and to continue talking about it. He suppressed the truth about the damaged ceiling. He deliberately allowed the public to go on believing, with Brindley, that he had aimed at the keyhole and had really gone through it, and his conscience was not at all disturbed. But that wicked traducers should hint that he had been using blank cartridge made him furiously indignant, and also exacerbated his gout, and he called on his cousin Joe to prove that he had never spent a penny on blank cartridge. It was a pity that he dragged the sardonic Joe back into the affair. Joe observed to him that, for a man in regular revolver practice, he was buying precious few cartridges, and so he had to lay in a stock. Now he dare not employ these cartridges, and yet he wished to make a noise with his revolver in order to convince the neighbourhood that he was in steady practice. Nor dare he buy blank cartridges from Joe. It was not safe to buy blank cartridges anywhere in the Five Towns, so easily does news travel there, and so easily are reputations blown. Hence it happened that Alderman Keats went as far as Crewe specially to buy blank cartridge, and he drowned the ball cartridge secretly in the Birches Pond. To such lengths may a timid man be driven in order to preserve and foster the renown of being a dog of the old sort. All kinds of persons used to hear the barking of the alderman's revolver in his stable yard, and the cumulative effect of these noises wore down calumny and incredulity. And of course, having once begun to practise, the alderman could not decently cease. The absurd situation endured, and a coral reef of ball cartridges might have appeared on the surface of Birches Pond, had it not been for the visit at enormous expense of Haggentote's 10 tigers to the Hanbridge Empire. This visit, epoch-making in the history of music hall enterprise in the Five Towns, coincided with the annual venison feast of a society known as Ye Ancient Corporation of Hanbridge, which society had no connection whatever with the real rate-levying corporation, but was a piece of elaborate machinery for dinner-eating. Alderman Keats naturally was prominent in the affair of the venison feast. Nobody was better fitted than he to be in the chair at such a solemnity. And in the chair he was, and therein did wonderful things. In putting the loyal toasts, he spoke for half an hour concerning the King's diplomacy, with a reference to royal gout, which was at least unusual. And then, when the feast was far advanced, he uprose, ignoring the toast list, and called upon the assembled company to drink to Old England and Old Port for ever, and a fig for gout. And after this, amid a genial informality, the conversation of a knot of cronies at the chair end of the table deviated to the noble art of self-defence, and so to revolvers, and the alderman, jolly but still aldermanic, produced his revolver, proving that it went even with his dress suit. "Look here," said one, "is it loaded?" "Of course," said the alderman. "Ball cartridge?" "Of course," said the alderman. "Well, would you mind putting it back in your pocket, with all this wine and whisky about?" The alderman complied, proud. He was limping goutily home with the Vice at something after midnight, when, as they passed the stage door of the Empire, both men were aware of fearsome sounds within the building, and the stage door was ajar. Being personages of great importance, they entered into the interior gloom, and collided with the watchman, who was rushing out. "Is that you, Alderman Keats?" exclaimed the watchman. "Thank Heaven!" The alderman then learnt that two of Hagentote's Bengal tigers were having an altercation about a lady, and that it looked like a duel to the death. Yet one would have supposed that, after two performances at 8:30 and 10:30 respectively, those tigers would have been too tired and bored to quarrel about anything whatever. The watchman had already fetched Hagentote from his hotel, but Hagentote's revolver was missing, could not be found anywhere, and the rifles were in such a state of fury that even the unique Hagentote would not enter their cage without a revolver. Meanwhile, invaluable tigers were being mutually destructive, and the watchman was just off to the police station to borrow a revolver. The roaring grew terrific. "Have you got your revolver, Alderman Keats?" asked the watchman. "No," said the alderman, "I haven't." "Oh," said the Vice, "I thought I saw you showing it to your cousin and some others." At the same moment Joe and some others, equally attracted by the roaring, strolled in. The alderman hesitated. "Yes, of course. I was forgetting." "If you'll lend it to the Professor a minute or two," said the watchman. The alderman pulled it out of his pocket and hesitatingly handed it to the watchman, and the watchman was turning hurriedly away with it when the alderman said nervously, "I'm not sure it's loaded." "Well, you're a nice chap," Joe Keats put in. "I forgot," muttered the alderman. "Oh, we'll soon see," said the watchman, who was accustomed to revolvers, and he opened it. "Yes," glancing into it, "it's loaded right enough," and turned away again towards the sound of the awful roaring. "I say," the alderman cried, "I'm afraid it's only blank cartridges." He might have saved his reputation by allowing the unique Hagentote to risk his life with a useless revolver, but he had a conscience. A clear conscience was his sole compensation as he faced the sardonic laughter which Joe led, and which finished off his reputation as a dog of the old sort. The annoying thing was that his noble self-sacrifice was useless, for immediately afterwards the roaring ceased, Hagentote having separated the combatants by means of a burning newspaper at the end of a stick. And the curious thing was that Alderman Keats never again mentioned his gout. End of section 22.
Section 23 of The Matador of the Five Towns and Other Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Andy Minter. The Matador of the Five Towns, and Other Stories by Arnold, Bennett.
Section 23. An Unfair Advantage. 1. James Peake and his wife, and Enoch Lovatt, his wife's half-sister's husband, and Randolph Sneyd, the architect, were just finishing the usual Saturday night game of solo, whilst in the drawing-room of Peake's large new residence at Hillport, that unique suburb of Bursley. Ella Peake, 20-year-old daughter of the house, sat reading in an armchair by the fire, which blazed in the patent radiating grate. Peake himself was banker, and he paid out silver and coppers at the rate of sixpence a dozen for the brass counters handed to him by his wife and Randolph Sneyd. "I've made summat on you to-night, Lovatt," said Peake, with his broad, easy laugh, as he reckoned up Lovatt's counters. Enoch Lovatt's principles, and the prominence of his position at the Bursley Wesleyan Chapel, though they did not prevent him from playing cards at his sister-in-law's house, absolutely forbade that he should play for money, and so it was always understood that the banker of the party should be his financier, supplying him with counters and taking the chances of gain or loss. By this kindly and ingenious arrangement Enoch Lovatt was enabled to live at peace with his conscience while gratifying that instinct for worldliness which the weekly visit to Peake's always aroused from its 7-day slumber into a brief activity. "6 shillings on my own, 5 and 4pence on you," said Peake. "Lovatt, we've had a good night to-night, no mistake." He laughed again, took out his knife, and cut a fresh cigar. "You don't think of your poor wife," said Mrs Peake, "who's lost over 3 shillings." And she nudged Randolph Sneyd. "Here, Nan," Peake answered quickly. "You shall have the lot." He dropped the 11 and 4pence into the kitty shell, and pushed it across the table to her. "Thank you, James," said Mrs Peake. "Ella, your father's given me 11 and 4pence. Oh, father!" The long girl by the fire jumped up, suddenly alert. "Do give me half a crown. You've no conception how hard up I am." "You're a grasping little vixen, that's what you are. Come and give me a light." He gazed affectionately at her smiling, flushed face and tangled hair. When she had lighted his cigar, Ella furtively introduced her thin fingers into his waistcoat pocket, where he usually kept a reserve of money against a possible failure of his trouser pockets. "May I?" she questioned, drawing out a coin. It was a 4-shilling piece. "No, get away." "I'll give you change." "Oh, take it," he yielded, "and be gone with ye. And ring for something to drink." "You are a duck, pa," she said, kissing him. The other two men smiled. "Let's have a tune now, Ella," said Peake, after she had rung the bell. The girl dutifully sat down to the piano and sang "The Children's Home." It was a song which always touched her father's heart. Peake was in one of those moods, at once gay and serene, which are possible only to successful middle-aged men, who have consistently worked hard without permitting the faculty for pleasure to deteriorate through disuse. He was devoted to his colliery, and his commercial acuteness was scarcely surpassed in the Five Towns, but he had always found time to amuse himself, and at 52, with a clear eye and a perfect digestion, his appreciation of good food, good wine, a good cigar, a fine horse, and a pretty woman was unimpaired. On this night his happiness was special. He had returned in the afternoon from a week's visit to London, and he was glad to get back again. He loved his wife and adored his daughter in his own way, and he enjoyed the feminized domestic atmosphere of his fine new house with exactly the same zest as, on another evening, he might have enjoyed the blue haze of the billiard room at the Conservative Club. The interior of the drawing-room realized very well Peake's ideals. It was large, with 2 magnificent windows, practicably comfortable and unpretentious. Peake despised, or rather he ignored, the aesthetic crazes which had run through fashionable Hillport like an infectious fever, ruthlessly decimating its turned and twisted mahogany and its floriferous carpets and wallpapers. That the soft, thick pile under his feet would wear for 20 years, and that the Welsbach incandescent mantles on the chandelier saved 30% in gas bills while increasing the light by 50%, it was these and similar facts which were uppermost in his mind
as he gazed round that room in which every object spoke of solid, unassuming luxury, and represented the best value to be obtained for money spent. He desired, of a Saturday night, nothing better than such a room, a couple of packs of cards, and the presence of wife and child, and his two lifelong friends, Sneyd and Lovatt, safe men both. After cards were over, and on Lovatt's account play ceased at 10 o'clock, they would discuss Bursley and Bursley folk with a shrewd sagacity and an intimate and complete knowledge of circumstance not to be found in combinations anywhere outside a small industrial town. To listen to Sneyd and Mrs Peake, when each sought to distance the other in tracing a genealogy, was to learn the history of a whole community and the secret springs of the actions which constituted its evolution. "Haven't you any news for me?" asked Peake during a pause in the talk. At the same moment the door opened and Mrs Lovatt entered. "Hey, Auntie Lovatt," he went on, greeting her. "We'd given you up." Mrs Lovatt usually visited the Peakes on Saturday evenings, but she came later than her husband. "But I was bound to come and see you to night, Uncle Peake, after your visit to the great city. Well, you're looking bonny." She shook hands with him warmly, her face beaming goodwill, and then she kissed her half sister and Ella, and told Sneyd that she had seen him that morning in the market-place. Mrs Peake and Mrs Lovatt differed remarkably in character and appearance, though this did not prevent them from being passionately attached to one another. Mrs Lovatt was small and rather plain. Content to be her husband's wife, she had no activities beyond her own home. Mrs Peake was tall and strikingly handsome, in spite of her 50 years, with a brilliant complexion and hair still raven black. Her energy was exhaustless and her spirit indomitable. She was the moving force of the Wesleyan Sunday School, and there was not a man in England who could have driven her against her will. She had a fortune of her own. Enoch Lovatt treated her with the respect due to an equal, who had more than once proved herself capable of insisting on independence and equal rights in the most pugnacious manner. "Well, Auntie," said Peake, "I've won 11 and 4pence to night, and my wife's collared it all from me." He laughed with glee. "You should be ashamed," said Mrs Lovatt, embracing the company in a glance of reproof which rested last on Enoch Lovatt. She was a Methodist of the strictest, and her husband happened to be the chapel steward. "If I had my way with those cards, I'd soon play with them. I'd play with them at the back of the fire. Now, you were asking for news when I came in, Uncle Peake. Have they told you about the new organ? We're quite full of it in our house." "No," said Peake, "they haven't." "What!" she cried reproachfully. "You haven't told him, Enoch? Nor you, Nan?" "Upon my word, it never entered my head," said Mrs Peake. "Well, Uncle Peake," Mrs Lovatt began, "we're going to have a new organ for the conference." "No, not before it's wanted," said Peake. "I do like a bit of good music at service, and Best himself couldn't make anything of that old wheezer we got now." "Is that the reason we see you so seldom at chapel?" Mrs Lovatt asked tartly. "I was there last Sunday morning." "And before that, Uncle Peake?" She smiled sweetly on him. Peake was one of the worldlings who, in a religious sense, existed precariously on the fringe of the Methodist Society. He rented a pew, and he was never remiss in dispatching his wife and daughter to occupy it. He imagined that his belief in the faith of his fathers was unshaken, but any reference to souls and salvation made him exceedingly restless and uncomfortable. He could not conceive himself crowned and harping in paradise, and yet he vaguely surmised that in the last result he would arrive at that place and state, wafted thither by the prayers of his womenfolk. Logical in all else, he was utterly illogical in his attitude towards the spiritual, an attitude which amounted to this: let a sleeping dog lie, but the animal isn't asleep and means mischief. He smiled meditatively at Mrs Lovatt's question, and turned it aside with another. "What about this organ?" "It's going to cost £900," continued Mrs Lovatt, "and Titus Blackhurst has arranged it all. It was built for a hall in Birmingham, but the manufacturers have somehow got it on their hands. Young Titus, the organist, has been over to see it, and he says it's a bargain. The affair was all arranged as quick as you please at the trustees' meeting last Monday. Titus Blackhurst said he would give £100 if 8 others would do the same within a fortnight. It must be settled at once. As Enoch said to me afterwards, it seemed as soon as Mr. Blackhurst had made his speech that we must have that organ. We really couldn't for shame to show up with the old one again at this conference. Don't you remember the funny speech the President made about it at the last conference 11 years ago? Of course he was very polite and nice with his sarcasm, but I'm sure he meant us to take the hint. Now, would you believe 7 out of those 8 subscriptions were promised by Wednesday morning? I think that was just splendid." "Well, well," exclaimed Peake, genuinely amazed at this proof of religious vitality. "Who are the subscribers?" "I'm one," said Enoch Lovatt, quietly, but with unconcealed pride. "And I'm another," said Mrs. Lovatt. "Bless you, I should have been ashamed for myself if I hadn't responded to such an appeal. You may say what you like about Titus Blackhurst. I know there's a good many that don't like him, but he's a real good sort. I'm sure he's the best Sunday school superintendent we have ever had. Then there's Mrs. Clayton Vernon, and Alderman Sutton, and young Henry Minors, and Eardley Brothers. They're giving 100 apiece," put in Lovatt, glancing at Randolph Sneyd. "I wish they'd pay their debts first," said Peake, with sudden savageness. "They're all right, I suppose," said Sneyd, interested, and leaning over towards Peake. "Oh, they're all right," Peake said testily. "At least, I hope so." And he gave a short, grim laugh. "But they're uncommon slow payers. I sent them an account for coal only last week. £350. Well, auntie, who's the 9th subscriber?" "Ah, that's the point," said Enoch Lovatt. "The 9th isn't forthcoming." Mrs. Lovatt looked straight at her sister's husband. "We want you to be the 9th," she said. "Me?" He laughed heartily, perceiving a broad humour in the suggestion. "Oh, but I mean it," Mrs. Lovatt insisted earnestly. "Your name was mentioned at the trustees' meeting, wasn't it, Enoch?" "Yes," said Enoch, "it was." "And dost mean to say as they thought I'd give 'em £100 towards the new organ?" said Peake, dropping into dialect. "Why not?" returned Mrs. Lovatt, her spirit roused. "I shall. Enoch will. Why not you?" "Oh, you're different. You're in it." "You can't deny that you're one of the richest pew holders in the chapel. What's £100 to you? Nothing, is it, Mr. Sneyd? When Mr. Coppinger, our superintendent minister, mentioned it to me yesterday, I told him I was sure you would consent." "You did?" "I did," she said boldly. "Well, I shanna." Like many warm-hearted, impulsive, and generous men, James Peake did not care that his generosity should be too positively assumed. To take it for granted was the surest way of extinguishing it. The pity was that Mrs. Lovatt, in the haste of her zeal for the amelioration of divine worship at Bursley Chapel, had overlooked this fact. Peake's manner was final. His wife threw a swift glance at Ella, who stood behind her father's chair, and received a message back that she too had discerned finality in the tone. Sneyd got up and, walking slowly to the fireplace, emitted the casual remark: "Yes, you will, Peake." He was a man of considerable education, and though in neither force nor astuteness was he the equal of James Peake, it often pleased him to adopt towards his friend a philosophic pose, the pose of a seer, of one far removed from the trivial disputes in which the colliery owner was frequently concerned. "Yes, you will, Peake," he repeated. "I shanna, Sneyd?" "I can read you like a book, Peake." This was a favourite phrase of Sneyd's, which Peake never heard without a faint secret annoyance. "At the bottom of your mind you mean to give that 100. It's your duty to do so, and you will. You'll let them persuade you." "I bet thee a shilling I don't." "Done." "Pshaw!" murmured Mrs. Lovatt. "I'm ashamed of both of you, betting on such a subject. On any subject," she added. "And Ella here too." "It's a bet, Sneyd," said Peake doggedly, and then turned to Lovatt. "What do you say about this, Enoch?" But Enoch Lovatt, self-trained to find safety in the middle, kept that neutral and diplomatic silence which invariably marked his demeanour in the presence of an argument. "Now, Nan, you'll talk to James," said Mrs Lovatt, when they all stood at the front door bidding good night. "Nay, I've nothing to do with it," Mrs Peake replied, as quickly as, at dinner, she might have set down a very hot plate. In some women profound affection exists side by side with a nervous dread lest that affection should seem to possess the least influence over its object. 2. Peake dismissed from his mind as grotesque the suggestion that he should contribute £100 to the organ fund. It revolted his sense of the fitness of things. The next morning he had entirely forgotten it. But 2 days afterwards, when he was finishing his midday dinner with a piece of Cheshire cheese, his wife said, "James, have you thought anything more about that organ affair?" She gave a timid little laugh. He looked at her thoughtfully for a moment, holding a morsel of cheese on the end of his knife, and then he ate the cheese in silence. "Nan," he said at length, rather deliberately, "have they been trying to come round you? Because it won't work. Upon my soul, I don't know what some people are dreaming of. I tell you, I was never more surprised in my life than when your sister made that suggestion. I'll give 'em a guinea towards their blooming organ, if that's any use to 'em. Ella, go and see if the horse is ready." "Yes, father." He felt genuinely aggrieved. "If they'd get a new organist," he remarked, with ferocious satire, 5 minutes later, as he lit a cigar, "and a new choir, I could see summat in that." In another minute he was driving at a fine pace towards his colliery at Toft End. The horse, with swift instinct, had understood that to day its master was not in the mood for badinage. Half way down the hill into Shawport he overtook a lady walking very slowly. "Mrs Sutton!" he shouted in astonishment. And when he had finished, with the tense frown which involuntarily accompanied the effort of stopping the horse dead within its own length, his face softened into a beautiful smile. "How's this?" he questioned. "Our mare's gone lame," Mrs Sutton answered, "and as I'm bound to get about, I'm bound to walk." He descended instantly from the dogcart. "Climb up," he said, "and tell me where you want to go." "Nay, nay." "Climb up," he repeated, and he helped her into the dogcart. "Well," she said, laughing, "what must be must. I was trudging home, and I hope it isn't out of your way." "It isn't," he said. "I'm for Toft End, and I should have driven up Trafalgar Road anyhow." Mrs Sutton was one of James Peake's ideals. He worshipped this small, frail woman of 55, whose soft eyes were the mirror of as candid a soul as was ever prisoned in Staffordshire clay. More than 40 years ago he had gone to school with her, and the remembrance of having kissed the pale girl when she was crying over a broken slate was still vivid in his mind. For nearly half a century she had remained to him exactly that same ethereal girl. The sole thing about her that puzzled him was that she had found anything attractive in the man whom she allowed to marry her, Alderman Sutton. In all else he regarded her as an angel. And to many others besides James Peake it seemed that Sarah Sutton wore robes of light. She was a creature born to be the succour of misery, the balm of distress. She would have soothed the two thieves on Calvary. Led on by the boundless instinct of a divine, all-embracing sympathy, the intrepid spirit within her continually forced its fragile physical mechanism into an activity which appeared almost supernatural. According to every rule of medicine she should have been dead long since, but she lived by volition. It was to the credit of Bursley that the whole town recognized in Sarah Sutton the treasure it held. "I wanted to see you," Mrs Sutton said, after they had exchanged various inquiries. "What about?" "Mrs Lovatt was telling me yesterday you hadn't made up your mind about that organ subscription." They were ascending the steepest part of Oldcastle Street, and Peake lowered the reins and let the horse into a walk. "Now look here, Mrs Sutton," he began with passionate frankness. "I can talk to you. You know I'm not one of their set, as it were. Of course I've got a pew and all that, but you know as well as I do that I don't belong to the chapel lot. Why should they ask me? Why should they come to me? Why should I give all that sum?" "Why?" she repeated the words, smiling. You're a generous man. You've felt the pleasure of giving. I always think of you as one of the most generous men in the town. I'm sure you've often realized what a really splendid thing it is to be able to give. Do you know, it comes over me sometimes like a perfect shock that if I couldn't give something, do something, I shouldn't be able to live. I would be obliged to go to bed and die right off. Ah, he murmured, and then paused. We aren't all like you, Mrs. Sutton. I wish to God we were. But seriously, I'm not forgiving that 100. It's against my grain, and that's flat. You'll excuse me speaking plain. I like it, she replied quickly. Then I know where I am. No, he reiterated firmly. I'm not forgiving that 100. Then I'm bound to say I'm sorry, she returned kindly. The whole scheme will be ruined. For it's one of those schemes that can only be carried out in a particular way. If they aren't done on the inspiration of the moment, they're not done at all. Not that I care so much for the organ itself. It was the idea that was so grand. Fancy £900 all in a minute. Such a thing was never known in Bursley Chapel before. Well, said Peake, I guess when it comes to the pinch they'll find someone else instead of me. They won't. There isn't another man who could afford it and trade so bad. Peake was silent, but he was inflexible. Not even Mrs. Sutton could make the suggestion of this subscription seem other than grossly unfair to him, an imposition on his good nature. Think it over, she said abruptly, after he had assisted her to alight at the top of Trafalgar Road. Think it over to oblige me. I'll do anything to oblige you, he replied, but I'll tell you this. He put his mouth to her ear and whispered, half smiling at the confession. You call me a generous man, but whenever that organ's mentioned, I feel just like a miser. Yes, as hard as a miser. Goodbye. I'm very glad to have had the pleasure of driving you up. He beamed on her as the horse shot forward. 3. This was on Tuesday. During the next few days, Peake went through a novel and very disturbing experience. He gradually became conscious of the power of that mysterious and all but irresistible moral force which is called public opinion. His own public of friends and acquaintances connected with the chapel seemed to be, for some inexplicable reason, against him on the question of the organ subscription. They visited him, even to the Reverend Mr. Coppinger, whom he heartily admired as having nothing of the parson about him, and argued quietly rather than severely, and then left him with the assurance that they relied on his sense of what was proper. He was amazed and secretly indignant at this combined attack. He thought it cowardly, unscrupulous. It resembled brigandage. He felt most acutely that no one had any right to demand from him that £100, and that they who did so transgressed one of those unwritten laws which govern social intercourse. Yet these transgressors were his friends, people who had earned his respect in years long past, and kept it through all the intricate situations arising out of daily contact. They could defy him to withdraw his respect now, and without knowing it, they did. He was left brooding, pained, bewildered. The explanation was simply this: he had failed to perceive that the grandiose idea of the ninefold organ fund had seized, fired, and obsessed the imaginations of the Wesleyan community, and that under the unwonted poetic stimulus they were capable of acting quite differently from their ordinary selves. Peake was perplexed. He felt that he was weakening, but being a man of resourceful obstinacy, he was by no means defeated. On Friday morning he told his wife that he should go and see a customer at Blackpool about a contract, and probably remain at the seaside for the week-end. Accustomed to these sudden movements, she packed his bag without questioning, and he set off for Knype station in the dog-cart. Once behind the horse, he felt safe. He could breathe again. The customer at Blackpool was merely an excuse to enable him to escape from the circle of undue influence. Ardently desiring to be in the train and on the other side of Crewe, he pulled up at his little order office in the market-place to give some instructions. As he did so, his clerk, Vaudrey, came rushing out and saw him. "I've just telephoned to your house, sir," Clark said excitedly. "They told me you were driving to Knype, and so I was coming after you in a cab." "Why, what's up now?" "Eardley Brothers have called their creditors together." What? I've just had a circular letter from them, sir. Peake stared at Vawdrey, and then took 2 steps forward, stamping his feet. "The devil!" he exclaimed with passionate ferocity. "The devil!" Other men of business besides James Peake made similar exclamations that morning, for the collapse of Eardley Brothers, the great earthenware manufacturers, who were chiefly responsible for the ruinous cutting of prices in the American and colonial markets, was no ordinary trade fiasco. Bursley was staggered, especially when it learned that the bank, the inaccessible and autocratic bank, was an unsecured creditor for £12,000. Peake abandoned the Blackpool customer and drove off to consult his lawyer at Hanbridge. He stood to lose £350, a matter sufficiently disconcerting. Yet in another part of his mind he felt strangely serene and happy, for he was sure now of winning his bet of 1 shilling with Randolph Sneyd. In the first place, the failure of Eardley's would annihilate the organ scheme, and in the second place, no one would have the audacity to ask him for a subscription of £100 when it was known that he would be a heavy sufferer in the Eardley bankruptcy. Later in the day he happened to meet one of the Eardleys, and at once launched into a stream of that hot invective of which he was a master, and all the while he was conscious of a certain hypocrisy in his attitude of violence. He could not dismiss the notion that the Eardleys had put him under an obligation by failing precisely at this juncture.
4. On the Saturday evening only Sneyd and Mrs. Lovatt came up to Hillport, Enoch Lovatt being away from home. Therefore there were no cards. They talked of the Eardley affair. "You'll have to manage with the old organ now," was one of the first things that Peake said to Mrs. Lovatt after he had recited his own woe. He smiled grimly as he said it. "I don't see why," Sneyd remarked. It was not true. He saw perfectly. But he enjoyed the rousing of Jim Peake into a warm altercation. "Not at all," said Mrs. Lovatt proudly. "We shall have the organ, I'm sure. There was an urgency committee meeting last night. Titus Blackhurst has most generously given another 100. He said it would be a shame if the bankruptcy of professed Methodists was allowed to prejudice the interests of the chapel. And the organ makers have taken £50 off their price. Now, who do you think has given another 50? Mr. Coppinger. He stood up last night. Mr. Blackhurst told me this morning, and he said, 'Friends, I've only £70 in the world, but I'll give £50 towards this organ.' There, what do you think of that? Isn't he a grand fellow?" "He is a grand fellow," said Peake, with emphasis, reflecting that the total income of the minister could not exceed £300 a year. "So you see you'll have to give your 100," Mrs. Lovatt continued. "You can't do otherwise after that." There was a pause. "I won't give it," said Peake. "I've said I won't, and I won't." He could think of no argument. To repeat that Eardley's bankruptcy would cost him dear seemed trivial. Nevertheless, the absence of any plausible argument served only to steel his resolution. At that moment the servant opened the door. "Mr. Titus Blackhurst, senior, to see you, sir." Peake and his wife looked at one another in amazement, and Sneyd laughed quietly. "He told me he should come up," Mrs. Lovatt explained. "Show him into the breakfast room, Clara," said Mrs. Peake to the servant. Peake frowned angrily as he crossed the hall, but as he opened the breakfast room door he contrived to straighten out his face into a semblance of urbanity. Though he could have enjoyed accelerating the passage of his visitor into the street, there were excellent commercial reasons why he should adopt less strenuous means towards the end which he had determined to gain. "Glad to see you, Mr. Blackhurst," he began, a little awkwardly. "You know, I suppose, what I've come for, Mr. Peake?" said the old man, in that rich, deep, oily voice of which Mrs. Lovatt, in one of those graphic phrases that came to her sometimes, had once remarked that it "must have been well basted in the cooking." "I suppose I do," Peake answered diffidently. Mr. Blackhurst took off a wrinkled black glove, stroked his grey beard, and started on a long account of the inception and progress of the organ scheme. Peake listened, and was drawn into an admission that it was a good scheme, and it deserved to succeed.
Mr Blackhurst then went on to make plain that it was in danger of utterly collapsing, that only one man of "our Methodist friends" could save it, and that both Mrs Sutton and Mrs Lovatt had advised him to come and make a personal appeal to that man. Peake knew of old, and in other affairs, the wily diplomatic skill of this Sunday school superintendent, and when Mr Blackhurst paused, he collected himself for an effort which should conclude the episode at a stroke. "The fact is," he said, "I've decided that I can't help you. It's no good beating about the bush, and so I tell you this at once. Mind you, Mr Blackhurst, if there's any one in Bursley that I should have liked to oblige, it's you. We've had business dealings, you and me, for many years now, and I fancy we know one another. I've the highest respect for you, and, if you'll excuse me saying so, I think you've some respect for me. My rule is always to be candid. I say what I mean, and I mean what I say, and so, as I've quite made up my mind, I let you know straight off. I can't do it. I simply can't do it." "Of course, if you put it that way, if you can't..." "I do put it that way, Mr Blackhurst," Peake continued quickly, warming himself into eloquence as he perceived the most effective line to pursue. "I admire your open-handedness. It's an example to us all. I wish I could imitate it, but I mustn't. I'm not one of them as rushes out and promises £100 before they've looked at their profit and loss account. Eardleys, for example. By the way, I'm pleased to hear from Sned that you aren't let in there. I'm one of the flats. £350. That's my bit. I'm told they won't pay 6 shillings in the pound. Isn't that a warning? What right had they to go offering their £100 apiece to your organ fund?" "It was very wrong," said Mr Blackhurst severely, "and what's more, it brings discredit on the Methodist Society." "True," agreed Peake. And then, leaning over confidentially, he spoke in a different voice. "If you ask me, I don't mind saying that I think that magnificent subscription of theirs was a deliberate and fraudulent attempt to inspire pressing creditors with fresh confidence. That's what I think. I call it monstrous." Mr Blackhurst nodded slowly, as though meditating on profound truths ably expressed. "Well," Peake resumed, "I'm not one of that sort. If I can afford to give, I give, but not otherwise. How do I know how I stand? I needn't tell you, Mr Blackhurst, that trade in this district is in a very queer state. A very queer state indeed. Outside yourself and Lovatt and one or two more, is there a single manufacturer in Bursley that knows how he stands? Is there one of them that knows whether he's making money or losing it? Look at prices. Can they go lower? And secret discounts, can they go higher? And all this affects the colliery owners. I shouldn't like to tell you the total of my book debt. I don't even care to think of it. And suppose there's a colliers' strike, as there's bound to be sooner or later, where shall we be then?" Mr Blackhurst nodded once more, while Peake, intoxicated by his own rhetoric, began actually to imagine that his commercial condition was indeed perilous. "I've had several very severe losses lately," he went on. "You know I was in that newspaper company. That was a heavy drain. I've done with newspapers for evermore. I was a fool. But calling myself a fool won't bring back what I've lost. It's got to be faced. Then there's that new shaft I sunk last year. What with floodings and flaws in the seam, that shaft alone is running me into a loss of £6 a week at this very moment, and has been for weeks." "Dear me!" exclaimed Mr Blackhurst sympathetically. "Yes, £6 a week. And that isn't all." He had entirely forgotten the immediate object of Mr Blackhurst's visit. "That isn't all. I've got a big lawsuit coming on with the railway company. Goodness knows how that will end. If I lose it, well..." "Mr Peake," said the old man with quiet firmness, "if things are as bad as you say, we will have a word of prayer." He knelt down and forthwith commenced to intercede with God on behalf of the luckless colliery owner, his business, his family, his soul. Peake jumped like a shot rabbit, reddening to the neck with stupefaction, excruciating sheepishness and annoyance. Never in the whole course of his life had he been caught in such an ineffable predicament. He strode to and fro in futile, speechless rage and shame. The situation was intolerable. He felt that at no matter what cost he must get Titus Blackhurst up from his knees. He approached him, meaning to put a hand on his shoulder, but dared not do so. Inarticulate sounds escaped from his throat, and then at last he burst out: "Ah, stop that! Stop that! I cannot stand it! Here, I'll give you a cheque for 100. I'll write it now." When Mr Blackhurst had departed, he rang for a brandy and soda, and then, after an interval, returned to the drawing room. "Sneyd," he said, trying to laugh, "here's your shilling. I've lost." "There!" exclaimed Mrs Lovatt. "Didn't I say that Mr Coppinger's example would do it? Eh, James? Bless you!" End of Section 23 and end of The Matador of the Five Towns by Arnold Bennett. Read by Andy Minter in Tring, Hertfordshire, January 2013.